You guys can hold it? Yeah, but I'm back for a while.
When we all moved to.
Yeah.
Maybe it's.
Ready, Bill?
Not here, sorry.
Yes, all good.
You were older and now they've been one booking time. So if you've already done it, it's done, they don't show you the what. Does that make sense? At the top. Very good.
Yeah.
I'll call this meeting to order. This is a regular meeting of the Board of Directors of the Bolinas Community Public Utility District. All directors are present. Today is November 20th, 2024. Time is 6 p.m. Next up the agenda is community expression, an opportunity for members of the audience to address the board on matters which are not on the agenda and for which we can take no action, but we would entertain a relatively brief discussion on whatever subject you'd like to present. Jenny?
Yes, thank you, and nice to see everybody back, get all together, nice. I was in a meeting of our, Cafecito, which is a school group, parent group that meets the Wednesday after school board meeting Tuesdays. And it meets in the library at school, and it's a way for parents to get together, particularly Spanish speaking parents. I was there today, and I have to say it was very heartbreaking and very moving. The number of people who were there, way more than usually. They're usually about 10 to 12 people. There were almost 20 there today. Because of the election and because of their fear and because they are such a part of our school community. And some of the stories are very alarming. And I am here talking about it because I would like to maybe see that it gets on your agenda, maybe for the next meeting to talk about our community. I know there's Los Angeles, school district is now sanctuary district. They're working on that for San Francisco. I don't know what Marin at large is doing, but I would like to see at least our Western communities feel protected. So my hope is that we can set up some sort of sanctuary in our Western communities for people, migrants, so that they can get information, what their rights are. Leo did quite an excellent job today in presenting, giving out some papers and presenting some information. From what I have heard, there are some of our parents who, even though they would have the privilege of calling 911, if they were feeling harassed or someone were coming to their home without a warrant or whatever the legalities need to be, they are afraid to call 911 because they have not had good experience with the sheriffs. Leo, and I don't want to go too in depth in this, but I just want to kind of bring you up to.
Well, it sounds like this is a subject you'd like the board to address.
I would, and Leo has talked to the Canal Alliance, which I think is a good group that can come and talk to some of our agencies, and I would love to see our library. It'd be great if you can pull together some books for kids, because our students are getting very nervous and they're anxious and stressed.
All right.
That's not good. So that's
Okay,
what I want to
the
bring.
board feels about putting it on the next agenda, as a sanctuary district, I assume is what that'd be the extent of what we could do.
I think it's, it's very much a topic of discussion at the school, in terms of what the Marin County School District, is able and wanting to do, and in terms of just being a place where we can disseminate information about people's rights. And I think that personally, anything that we can do as a community to hold space, to disseminate information, anything that we can do to be helpful, I think would be great.
Okay,
The school's very actively involved in that, and I would like, I think it would be nice if the greater community also was.
so you support putting it on the agenda?
Yeah, I'd like to just,
All right.
it'd be nice to have Leo come and talk and see what.
It would be good, and then you can mention
What do you
that.
think, Andrew?
Yeah, I think it would be good for someone to, and maybe it's a school to look at the county's policy on this, and then maybe at the next meeting, we have someone from the school here.
Just information.
Yeah,
on that.
just to make a,
And even if there were numbers, if people had the number for people to be able to call, that was not a government number, that would be people who would be willing to step up in places where they could go that are safe if they can't get to their homes. I know that the building is condemned, but I did think there is that, because the building is there in an emergency, if people needed to, could not be to their homes. If that were something that could be.
But this is something that we'd have to take up to vote on and decide. So right now, this we need to see if we have a motivation to put it on our agenda. What do you think, Kevin?
Yeah, that's a heavy topic, but thanks for bringing it up. Very heartbreaking to hear about your experience this morning. Yeah, I mean, I'd certainly be willing to talk about it at a BCPUD meeting and what context or what BCPUD can do. I'm not sure, but I'm definitely willing to talk about it. What do you
Yes,
see?
I would agree. I mean, I think just broadcasting information, I mean, obviously, we are government agency and body, so, whether that, helps assist the people that you're concerned about, or that they are concerned and being able to call, but I think.
Okay.
Now, I just want to say one other thing. I don't know about accommodating, our building, so that, let's take that on a case by case basis, but there's a reason why we didn't hear and. So I would need to.
Get into that one.
Yeah.
Okay, so you want to put that on the agenda for the next meeting? All right, thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
Are there any other community expression items, either from people in the room or on Zoom? Right, not hearing any. Next item on the agenda is to consider amending the order of items in the agenda. What do you say, George? Are there something?
Well, I would suggest that maybe since Isabel is here to be presenting to us, that maybe we could sort of up, so that.
Right, so which item is that? Number,
That's
Three.
three.
okay, any others?
Are you here to talk about the recology?
yeah, I'm just here in case there's any questions or any clarification. So,
Okay.
That would be number, is that what we did, 9 or not?
Yeah, 9. I mean, we don't have a formal presentation or anything like that, but
Okay.
we were just gonna basically kind of talk about where we are in the process, so we build that up too.
So shall we move that one up also to give this gentleman a share?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, he's not on drag.
Other votes are still like that. Okay, any other items that we should change in order? So we would put these ahead of your manager's report.
Yep,
Okay, go.
yeah, and I'll say ecology first.
The ecology one first, okay. All right, Georgia, do you want to introduce the subject and then?
Sure, and Jack, and just to remind everybody, Jack and Kevin are on our ad hoc detailed rate review committee. We are working towards finalizing what the increased rates will be. We are still theoretically on a schedule to implement those February 1. But we need to get that proposition, the 218 proposition published in advance of that, and so we're kind of right at the point of, maybe not meeting that deadline depending on how this kind of next round of back and forth goes. And that's, I mean, everything seems to be going well. We had a meeting with, a Zoom meeting with ecology representatives on October 25th. And then we've had some back and forth formal letters And it all seems to be moving in a good direction, but it's not been finalized yet.
Yeah, I generally agree. We, we accepted most of the, the conditions that the city had, just needed a few clarifications on a couple things. So yeah, to move on.
Right, just for the benefit of the audience, Recology is asked to increase the rates for the garbage collection. We have a long-term contract with them, but they say that they need to increase the rates now. So Kevin and I, along with George, have been a committee to negotiate with the people at Recology to come up with the rates that we all seem to be able to agree upon, and it's moving in the right direction, to say. So we'll just keep negotiating and talking and come to a conclusion.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? You said we're not meeting the deadlines, is that right?
Well,
Can you,
I mean, basically,
Can we
because
just-
it's a rate increase, we need to publish as part of the Prop 218, like effectively, this is, considered a tax. And so we need to, abide by the windows, by which, you publish your proposed rate increases, and then you give people a formal opportunity to, what is it? Object to those. And so that essentially adds this whole kind of window on top of wherever we agree upon, our negotiations. And so basically, that's pushing us out to February 1, where that's where we would, where the rate increases would take effect. But that's contingent on us coming to an agreement prior to November 25th, I think is the deadline. So that's where, it's tight.
Is it a one-time increase or is it over 5 years?
It'd be projected over a long period of time. Okay, anything else on that subject?
Question for committee is hitting a November 25th deadline. I mean, that's like the day before Thanksgiving. I mean, is that possible, or are you far enough away that you think that you need to have a couple more?
and it's 5 days away.
I think it's,
I'm just trying to get a sense of how close are you? Like, could we wrap this up, or does it need to have some?
that's why I said theoretically.
Yeah.
I think that likely we're not gonna
No.
meet that. I mean, basically, we are, it's the ball is in our court. I'm gonna be submitting a letter probably after this meeting tonight. Kevin and I discussed, just the final kind of language that we're including in that today. And we'll send that out as soon as possible. Obviously, if they turn around tomorrow and everything's fully, and we're all in agreement, then it seems like, okay, we could meet the.
Sorry, the letter's going to who?
To Recology.
Yeah.
You're aware of this letter.
Yeah, I am now. No, I knew we had sent a letter, I think, back like a couple weeks ago, November 4th.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Waiting for a response, happy to.
Yeah.
Get it.
Yeah, we could reach agreement on the terms close enough so that we could send notice out to the all the ratepayers by the time we're required to, so it's moving along. All right, anything else on that subject then? Right?
Thank you for coming.
No, I really appreciate you guys.
Drive
That's
safe.
nice. Thank you.
Drive slowly.
Yeah.
And it's not the first year, it's the second.
Okay. Okay, got it.
They
So you
may not-
see the
yeah.
first one, keep an eye on it, okay.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right, then I'll move on to item 3. Zero electricity grid in Bolinas, presented by Isabel Winstead.
Isabel, do you want me to, I'll share screen and you just tell me when to switch slides.
Cool.
I can come up here and maybe, I don't know if this looks like it's a microphone, but I don't know if I really need that for the size of this room.
I think we
I
can
think
hear
that's
you.
more for the Zoom, I think, so that'd be for people.
Since you said to share.
All right, I'll stand right here. Is this a good place for everybody?
Yeah,
And it
great.
looks like I'm on the Zoom. Hi, my name is Isabel. I'm going to be presenting on expanding BPUD to include electric services and how that can help Bolinas achieve both a net zero electricity grid and also more resilience from large scale power outages that we are all very experienced with due to PG&E, especially right now with this crazy storm we're experiencing. Maybe I can change the slide like this. Will this work or Bell?
I'm not.
I could stop sharing and then you could try it.
Okay,
Maybe
maybe
say next slide.
next slide.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, I should also say this means a lot to me because I grew up in Bolinas and a lot of the community values here of environmental stewardship, community, self-sufficiency even inspired me to study environmental economics and policy at Berkeley. So this feels very right for me to be back here, talking to other community members and folks that came before me and inspired me to be doing what I'm doing now. So the first step of this is governance, which is what you guys are with public utilities. And next slide. So first, many publicly owned utilities like BCPUD actually do provide electric services. And that can range from either managing the generation, the procurement, the distribution, or the implementation of energy efficiency or renewable initiatives. Next slide. But since BCPUD already does not manage electric services, it is very much within their legal ability to expand to include electric services. And I'm going to show you guys how that's possible. So first off, just to show that this is possible and it's not just a totally pipe dream idea, this is how it was done in Jefferson County in Washington. First, the challenge was that the county's private power, Puget Sound Energy, entered into a foreign contract agreement with an Australian company for around $7.4 billion. And this really united Democrats and Republicans alike. The Republicans did not like the anti-foreign influence, and then the Democrats also did not like the anti-corporate, or they liked the anti-corporate sentiment that comes with transitioning from private power to public power. And many folks also felt that Puget Sound Energy was unreliable and the rates were too expensive. So Puget Sound Energy obviously met them with not the most receptive minds because they were going to be losing a lot of their customer base. So they spent a huge sum of money on a counter campaign, which amounted to around $30 per vote to try to make sure that this proposition, to even put it on the ballots for the community members to decide if they wanted to have public power was not possible. So they were trying to be kind of like anti-democratic in this sense, which I think is not a very good thing. And even though they invested a lot of money, around $250,000 total in this, the community still decided that they wanted to put it on the ballot. So Proposition 1 was put on the ballot, and it was left up to the community to decide if they wanted to expand their public utilities district to also include electric services. And then it ended up passing. And this is because a lot of local organization and local activism. And as a result, the public utilities district there was able to declare eminent domain and reacquire their transmission lines and all the different things that we were discussing, like the procurement process, et cetera, from the private entity, which is Puget Sound Energy. And they were able to work with the state, which gave them a cost estimate of how much that infrastructure cost. And then they were able to acquire a loan from the Rural Utility Service, which is a federal grant system that gives public utilities like BCPUD and like Jefferson County Public Utility District the finances that they need to reacquire this grid infrastructure. So they also obviously hired staff with electrical expertise because they were expanding their services to things that their current staff was not familiar with. And then in 2013, just 5 years later, they were able to expand their services to also include electric. And as a result, which it's a bit hard to see with the way this is set up.
Isabel, you want to minimize the?
Oh, yeah,
There you go.
sweet. As a result, their electric service runs smoothly. The rates are lower, which is very important to a lot of folks. Maybe they don't care about the environmental motivations of this, but certainly the economic ones are compelling. The energy is also cleaner. They're able to acquire their electricity from the Bonneville Power Administration and really negotiate what type of electricity generation they're receiving. And importantly, the utility revenue also stays within the local economy. So this provides more jobs for the local community, as well as all of the profit that they're receiving can go back to clean energy initiatives and other things that the community wants to do with those funds. And next slide. So my presentation is that Bolinas may tell a similar story in the future. This, of course, needs a lot more assessment than what I'm going to get into in this presentation. This is a very big undertaking, but I want to create the idea in your guys' mind and, let you consider it when you go home. And if you feel so inspired, I can give you more data and more clear steps on how to do this, but this is just a summary. So now I want to talk about infrastructure. I took this idea of expanding BPUD's governance to also include electric services, to also estimating how much it would cost to achieve all of this generation right here in Bolinas. So that involves some statistical analysis that I'm going to show you guys here. So first, I wanted to answer the question, what is our current distance to net zero? Because, as I mentioned before, there's obviously the economic argument of lowering the rates, but there's also the environmental argument. As I mentioned in the beginning, growing up here definitely inspired me to do environmentalism. Merging with nature is very important, and trying to challenge some of the environmental issues that we're facing right now, which a lot of them stem from our electricity sources, is very important. So net zero is a very good thing to aspire towards. And it's very possible that BPUD could source all of their electricity from renewables, given our current electricity consumption. So this graph is showing how electricity consumption has increased over the last decade, and it's showing where that is already coming from as well. So the darker green right here is showing the proportion of electricity consumption that's currently coming from local renewable production. So that includes residential solar, that includes the solar we have, I think actually on the fire department building, all the solar that's been installed and connected to the grid in Bolinas. So that's kind of a big proportion right now. We're not doing too bad, but we could also do perhaps a little bit better and generate it all here if we wanted to. And right here, that kind of like lime green color, that's showing the percentage or the proportion that's matched by utility scale renewables. So since we are still bringing in electricity from PG&E, this is the proportion that is renewable from California's renewable portfolio standard. So that includes things like wind generation, biomass, solar, obviously, and a bunch of other different ways that PG&E has progressed towards California's renewable portfolio standard, which increases over the years as well to get more and more clean and green. And then the important part is this kind of darker purple eggplant color that we're seeing on the top. And that's the proportion of electricity consumption that's coming from non-renewables. So that's what we want to get rid of. And after assessing that, I discovered that there was around 2,400,000 kilowatt hours that need to be installed infrastructure-wise to match the total town consumption with local renewable production. And if we do want to continue incorporating California's renewable portfolio from PG&E, that would be a lot smaller and much more in range, around 500,000 kilowatt hours annually. It's also important to note that this data does not include commercial consumption, and that's because of the privacy restrictions on the California Energy Commission's release of the zip code based electricity consumption data, because there's not enough commercial consumers in Bolinas for it to be like sufficiently anonymous, if that makes sense. So this is mostly just residential consumption, but I think that's the larger proportion of the electricity consumption in Bolinas at this moment right now. Okay, next slide. So that data is nice to have, and it's nice to know how far we are, but it's also nice to know how we can achieve that. So I ran a couple different infrastructure solutions to show how we could achieve various pathways to net zero, because we could achieve complete self-sufficiency, or we could just match that non-renewable consumption gap, and those different pathways would look drastically different. And I also want to note that even these infrastructure solutions are very rough. There's a lot of different dimensions to each of these estimates, and more research would need to be put into doing a complete analysis of how to finish these infrastructure solutions correctly. But this is a good starting point for y'all to consider. So first, if we wanted to do total local consumption and include.
Excuse me. he has his hand
Hey,
up.
can I, before you go on,
Of
can I
course.
ask a question?
Yeah.
When you had done the previous slide, you had like 2.49 million kilowatts or whatever.
Kilowatt hours.
Is the lime and the purple what you're proposing that we supplement with the green on the bottom? Or just?
So I have, yeah, that's what I was mentioning, there's a couple different infrastructure solutions to achieve.
Well, when you
net
say
zero.
that, when that middle paragraph there, what is that?
Oh, yeah,
referring
that
to?
is matching all of the consumption with local production. So that would be in addition to that darker green we're seeing, the local consumption, so that would match the lime green and the eggplant.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course, and then the 500,000 is just the eggplant.
And that's based on the year 2022.
Yes, that is, because there wasn't data for 2023 yet, because they haven't finished updating their cycle. And I believe that data was not from the California Energy Commission for that specific restriction, that was from the California Distributed Generation Statistics, because that is covering the amount of local production. And I also have more data specifically on energy consumption and local production as well, that if you guys are interested, I can definitely send you some beautiful graphs. But right now, we can talk about the infrastructure solutions.
Yeah, 'cause I'm kind of curious,
Sorry,
what
yeah.
happened between 2016 and 2022?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. I'm gonna get into that. Yeah, okay, so for infrastructure solutions, again, there's a couple different ways to achieve this. One is to match total local consumption, so that would be not even including the local residential solar or commercial solar that's already been installed. That's just matching all of our consumption with like one way for BPUD to kind of concisely and efficiently manage it. And the solution I found that seemed most viable, given that scale, was a 1.5 megawatt turbine that would generate around 5 million kilowatt hours a year. And the land estimate is fairly large for that. That's around 120 acres. And the installation cost, and these estimates are with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory estimates for wind turbines and ground-mounted one-axis tracking solar systems. This is using their data, and I can send you guys the math on that too. But that would cost around $5 million to install, and then the maintenance would be $60,000 annually. So that would totally go above and beyond Bolinas' current energy consumption, and would leave room for us to send electricity back to the grid, and potentially even receive money from the excess or energy generation that we're producing here. And then the other infrastructure solution was matching the non-local consumption gap. So that's back to your question about that 2.5 million kilowatt hours a year. And there's a couple different ways to achieve that. One could also be through wind, which is, and the solution that made the most sense to me was 9 100 kilowatt commercial turbines. The land estimate for that is around 76 acres. The installation would be a bit larger cost-wise, and that would be around $5.6 million. The maintenance costs would be smaller, and that would be around $35,000 a year. And then the solar solution I found, which is, I think, important to have as a comparison because it uses a lot less land, would be using ground-mounted one-axis tracking on a land estimate of around 11.75 acres, and the installation cost would be around $2 million, and the maintenance would be around $20,000 a year. And that would cover the non-local consumption gap, but would still critically rely on the residential energy that's produced here. Okay, and then I have 2 more infrastructure solutions that we can go to on the next slide.
Tracy, do you have something?
Quick question is,
Mhm.
on the non-local consumption gap, it's what you've lined out there is either the wind or the solar. It's not, you're not needed to look at both.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, that's correct.
And the maintenance cost for the solar is
Just making sure all the panels are running effectively.
like
each year,
having
cleaning it.
somebody mind them,
Yes,
basically.
exactly,
Okay,
yeah.
makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Associated labor costs.
Okay.
You typically don't see that on smaller size systems, like you might not see maintenance costs if you have just a tiny system installed on your house or like your boat, for example. But definitely with a system this large, you want to make sure you're maintaining it properly because of the initial investment cost.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
I think that's a really good point because I read it as it's wind and solar.
Yes,
It's either or, yeah.
I will definitely consider that
Okay.
as I present in the future. So
But Isn't there a benefit to sort of diversifying your energy
Yeah.
production, versus having one massive, 1.5 megawatt turbine that could potentially have problems or, and then you're sort of,
Yeah, definitely.
versus, spreading out with solar, wind, many turbines, what's the philosophy there?
Yeah, I think intermittency is a huge issue with a lot of renewable energy systems. There are certainly days where the sun is shining, but the wind is not blowing. And then in that case, you would really benefit from having both types of systems installed. So you wouldn't need to sap your storage. And that can definitely be considered with further analysis if BPUD decided they wanted to pursue installing the requisite infrastructure to achieve net zero. And that's a great question. And I actually have some information on intermittency that we can dive into later if you're curious to explore that further. The two other infrastructure solutions I have are matching the renewable consumption gap. So that's that smaller value that I came up with, which is around 500,000 kilowatt hours annually. So that's going to be a lot less expensive, and the land use is also going to be much more manageable. And enabling this would ensure that Bolinas was net zero by generating sufficient renewable energy to offset periods where it relies on non-renewable power from California's larger electricity grid. But it's a little bit more of a stretch, I think, and it's a little bit less like as complete, I think, as the other solutions I've provided. So I do definitely want to note that there's some trade-offs between the lower cost and then the like complete environmental motivations that I think this presentation is motivated by. So that could be done with wind with 200 kilowatt commercial turbines. The land requirement for that would be 17 acres. The installation would be manageable at $1.2 million. And then the maintenance per year would be around $8,000. And then the solar solution for that is still ground mounted, one axis tracking. The land requirement would be 2.36 acres. The installation would be around $500,000. And then the maintenance annually would be around $5,000 a year. So that's, a much smaller system, but would still ensure that in some Bolinas is achieving net zero. It would just be using the grid as a battery. So there would be still cases where it's using non-renewable energy, but it's giving enough back that it's offsetting that later on in the larger grid system. I think that's kind of a strange, complicated thing to convey. So hopefully that gets across effectively to everyone. And then excess renewable energy means that you have a very large system and Bolinas is generating a lot of excess power. And that means it can sell it to neighboring communities and continue helping California reduce its carbon emissions. And this could generate around $200,000 a year in revenue. And ideally, this could be done with wind. You could install one 3.3 megawatt utility scale turbine, which generates annually around 14 million kilowatt hours a year. So that's currently a lot more than Bolinas consumes. That's around 10 million kilowatt hours of energy more than Bolinas already consumes. So that's energy that would be going back for other perhaps areas in West Marin that are not using or not relying on renewable electricity in the same way that Bolinas would be under this hypothetical. The installation of that is 5 million or around 6 million actually, and the maintenance would be $135,000 a year.
Just a question. So this is the excess renewable energy is the only one that you have identified would generate revenue. Is that right?
Well, the first solution I covered, it was just such a close comparison between one that was just like 100,000 kilowatt hours extra annually, that technically it's still generating income for BPUD, but it's mostly just because of the you wouldn't want to have the economies of scale argument. So you're generating income still, but it's kind of only, I think the math I did said it was only around like $20,000 a year,
Okay.
which is
Okay.
a lot smaller and perhaps negligible, considering the scale you guys run on when it's compared to a larger system, which in theory could generate around $200,000 a year.
Okay, and then this is minor, but two things. Looks like Yeah, somebody left Brisbane, okay. The other minor thing, I'm wondering if you're making a recommendation of wind over solar, only because I see on your maintenance of renewable consumption, you're down to like the 33 cents.
Yeah.
And everything else is kind of big picture, so I'm wondering, is that something that you were, you had more like finite numbers, or?
That's a good question. It might have just been that I didn't
Okay.
round up in that case.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I can definitely send you the math if you're interested in that for sure. I think you raised a really interesting question earlier about the value of having a diverse portfolio of energy generation. So I think that that could be considered because there is definitely benefits from having both of these, and you can do the cost analysis. However, there are economies of scale arguments that I will get into. So if you do have a diverse portfolio, perhaps like you're suggesting, and you have a smaller wind as compared to like a larger just solo wind and a smaller solar as compared to just a main solar source, that's going to end up costing more perhaps. And I think I'm gonna get into that on the challenges section. So maybe we go to the next slide. Oh,
I have a quick question.
Mhm.
I'm a visual person and I would love to see or to know, to see what's the largest 3.3 megawatt utility turbine, how tall that is and what
Yeah.
that would look like in the Bolinas landscape or just outside. I mean, I know we're sort of getting ahead of ourselves here, but I think visuals really tell the story in a nice way to some people.
Yeah.
I could also imagine half the town would love it, half the town would absolutely hate it, so maybe we're not ready to be so divisive, but just curious what a turbine of that size, you know, how tall it is, like what are we talking about?
How tall it is?
You know?
I'm not sure off the top of my head, I'm gonna be honest. I know the land use is pretty large. But I do get in a bit later to areas perhaps that would be viable and a little bit less obtrusive for the community. That I can definitely get into, but in terms of actual height, I can't give you a specific number, but it is pretty big.
Yeah.
But you could also consider, this presentation does not address offshore wind because that's a bit more complicated infrastructurally to install, but that could also be considered as well. And this is actually, to your point, any development of clean energy infrastructure is bounded by the Bolinas Community Plan, which states that the expansion or addition of public utilities should correlate with the growth rate projected by the plan.
What is the plan growth rate, anybody know? I mean, it might be pretty close to zero, right?
Yeah, close to zero.
Do you get into talking about, other than the local coastal plan, the Bolinas plan, there's coastal commission oversight here, we're in the coastal zone, there's Marin County regulations. And again, I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but these are the kind of questions that I think of, you know, how does the coastal commission feel about these types of projects? Have they approved any that you know about? Have you looked into that at all yet?
Yeah, that's actually towards the end of my presentation, yeah. I don't talk about the coastal commission in particular, but I do mention the Marin County high jury, I believe it's called, as well as the Bolinas community plan, what they have to say about environmental projects like this. Yeah. So challenges. There's a lot of challenges with this. It's no easy project. First, intermittency. As we were talking about earlier, renewable energy relies on fluctuating natural resources, and this results in both daily and seasonal variation. So in particular, this is a graph of the variation in monthly production within the current solar that's installed here. So we are seeing that the solar systems are getting a bit larger, and as a result, we're seeing, you know, the lower months, like in January towards the far left side, they're getting higher and higher, but in some, the parabolic structure of how the quantity of renewable energy kilowatt hours is generated is just kind of stretching out. So storage solutions, which can be batteries primarily, must parallel the amount of infrastructure that we're installing. Otherwise, we're gonna just keep seeing, you know, peak production for solar, at least in the summer months, and then when it's the winter months, we're not going to be able to, you know, match that in the same way. So as a solution for that, and this obviously needs to be researched more depending on which system would be pursued. Tesla Megapacks do present a commercial scale battery solution, and each unit stores around 1,927 kilowatt hours of energy. And mathematically, the kilowatt hour energy is a different scale than the kilowatt hour energy conversion, just to note. So that would cover the amount of consumption that Bolinas needs, and that would cost around $2 million to purchase, and then the installation cost of that would be around $800,000. Okay, next slide. So another concern is variable demand. Electricity demand is generally unpredictable. Theoretically, in a society, you could have infinite electricity demand depending on the society's concerns. Like if we wanted to go to a different galaxy, that would require a lot of electricity. But luckily in Bolinas, because of the water moratorium and the community plan development goals, there is kind of like limits to how much additional electricity we might consume, because it's really the household count that determines the electricity consumption. But average household electricity consumption does remain uncertain. A huge contributing factor of that is electrification, which is actually a really good thing. We want to use less natural gas, and we want to use more electricity so we can control where the sources are coming from and try to switch them to renewable sources. And this graph in particular shows the average household electricity consumption increasing over the last decade. There have certainly been lows, but overall, the trend is showing that our electricity consumption is increasing. I didn't particularly include my slides here, but a huge factor of that is the switch over to electric vehicles, especially because the gas station was closed recently. So I think a lot of folks are feeling pressure to have electric vehicles. And other factors that could reduce the electricity consumption are appliance efficiency and conservation efforts. Okay, next slide. Oh, and that's going to be important to consider because if we install one system with the goal of becoming net zero, it could be the case 5 years down the line that our electricity consumption has increased beyond what our source can manage and cover. So another concern after intermittency and variable demand is the funding. How are we going to pay for this project? So as I discussed briefly in the Jefferson County Public Utilities example, I talked about the Rural Utility Service grants that the federal government provides. That's going to be really key in actually purchasing the transmission lines from PG&E. So that is one direction that BPUD could take if they just wanted to manage the transmission lines in the distribution system. That alone would decrease rates and transition to clean power and keep the control of electricity within the community. But if they wanted to extend that further to include these infrastructure solutions, some funding ways to make that happen are the California Public Utilities Commission, which has allocated around $200 million in 2021 for statewide microgrid incentive programs, which are specifically aimed at supporting vulnerable communities, perhaps like Bolinas, that are affected by grid outages. And they want to test new technologies and also regulatory approaches, which would be covered by what BPUD could be doing to guide future actions. And the Marin County Civil Grand Jury strongly reports and recommends that private funding should be aggressively explored for microgrids in West Marin. But it's also important to note that federal state security laws are designed to protect the public from fraud and risky investments that do create barriers for public funding of community scale renewable energy projects like this, because it could be used by somebody who's malicious. However, Bolinas has been able to overcome these public crowdfunding regulations before, especially around when COVID was happening, when the community raised around $300,000 to provide free COVID antibody tests for the residents here. Okay, next slide. So economies of scale is also another challenge. For nearly a century, conventional wisdom has said that the larger the power generating source is, the more cost effective it's going to be. This is a very controversial idea in environmental economics, especially because a lot of the studies that show that economies of scale is a really big issue are privately funded. And it's in the utility's best interest to have control over where the generation is coming from, instead of having distributed generation. So kind of vigilante researchers, actually from my alma mater, have fact checked that and showed that there's kind of diminishing returns for this economies of scale debate, because transmission costs are increasing, especially with all the wildfires we're seeing. And there's also a lot of transmission losses. So there are plenty of arguments to be made to show that community scale systems, like the ones advocated previously for in this presentation, are achieving the ideal balance of that economies of scale debate. And yeah.
I'm sorry, speaking of distribution, is that included in your cost, or would you be using the distribution system already in place by PG&E, or I don't remember seeing that in there?
Yeah, so for BPUD to expand its services to include electricity, it would need to declare eminent domain over PG&E's transmission and distribution systems. So it would control that transmission system. And as a result, it would have more control over that, and that would reduce transmission costs, because it would just be a bit more local. And if the power was generated here in a microgrid, essentially, it would make it so it wasn't needing to come from a different part of California and travel a very long distance to get out here and go to the residents. So that would reduce the transmission losses as well. Yeah, I'm just thinking about driving to high school every morning and how that was so challenging. And you can imagine the electricity has to do that times 10 if it's coming from, you know, a desert somewhere in a different state, for example. So there are definitely dynamics to consider when evaluating some of the research that has shown that economies of scale are important to consider, especially when you acknowledge that solar power remains competitive at almost any scale, whether that just be the little residential panel you have, or whether it be the one you put on the school, or whether it be, you know, a utility scale one, for sure. And then as far as wind goes, the larger the turbine is proportional to the cost of kilowatt hour energy produced by it, but there is not a lot of evidence to show that that same benefit relates to the amount of turbines you have. So it's mostly for wind production, it's mostly just how large your turbine is, not how many turbines you have. But again, the economies of scale debate is very controversial in the field of environmental economics. I know when I was talking to this to some of my professors at Berkeley about this, I received some varying feedback, because some professors were like, oh no, like it'll never work because of economies of scale, and other professors were like, no, that's BS. Don't listen to my colleague. So definitely consider that how you will. Okay, next slide. So now is kind of the fun part. We get to be idealistic and talk about the motivations for why BPUD and the larger Bolinas community might want to consider a project like this. Next slide. So at the heart of the Bolinas community plan is what we can do for ourselves will more likely get done. And I think broadly, as we've seen, and you guys can probably infer, that's what this project is all about. Okay, next slide. And doing this is very important because even though I think here in West Marin, we might like to consider ourselves very environmentally friendly, we are still falling short of executive order, the executive order that required us to reduce our carbon emissions 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. So this graph is not for Bolinas in particular, but this is just for the West Marin unincorporated area. And we can see our carbon emissions are decreasing. But then when I ran a regression on how those decreasing points over the last decade have will change over the next couple years as we approach 2030, which is where that target is set, we are clearly off target from achieving that 40% reduction in carbon emissions below 1990 levels. So generating sufficient renewable energy to match consumption, as well as, you know, incentivizing folks to transition towards electrification because their rates are lower for electricity, would help support these emission reduction targets. And, if we can do it ourselves, I think that we probably should. Because again, we're more likely to get it done as the Bolinas Community Plan is arguing. Okay, next slide. So also, the community plan supports expanding BPUD services to include electricity by integrating alternative energy sources to support Bolinas's goals for self-sufficiency and independence. Next slide. So this is a very important argument when we're considering reliability. Local power generation is essential for community facilities like hospitals or internet in the event of larger grid failures. PG&E power shutoffs are frequent, especially in periods of increased fire danger. And I think we can all recognize that these periods of fire danger have only increased in our lifetime and are very concerning. I remember when I was in high school, the skies were just turning like this bright, vivid orange, and it felt like it was never going to end. And that definitely kind of shakes you to your core, and all the power got shut off, and it just felt very scary. So I think it would be helpful to have local generation as a result. And then the Marin County Civil Grand Jury also recognizes that PG&E is unreliable in terms of electric transmission infrastructure, and it does recommend strongly the establishment of microgrids in Western Marin by 2024. And it is currently 2024 right now, and we have not made as much progress in installing these local microgrids as we might want to increase resilience against power outages. Okay, next slide. And the Bolinas Community Plan also emphasizes environmental stewardship. In quotes, they say, protecting the environment, including plants and animal wildlife, as well as the landscape, is more than a legal duty under the Environmental Protection Act. And I think that just shows that it's also kind of a spiritual one and a very important one towards the residents here. I think you can even relate this back to our history of environmental activism. In 1971, a lot of people moved out here to protect the lagoon from the San Francisco oil spill. And I think we need to keep that same energy when we're considering alternative energy sources in Bolinas. But with that comes this challenge of balancing environmental objectives. On the one hand, we want to transition towards clean, green sources of power and support our community with more resilience and lower electricity rates. But on the other hand, we don't really want to disturb the natural beauty here. I included this wonderful aerial photo to show how pristine the landscape is and how special it is to be able to experience and merge with nature here. And it would be challenging to, put a big windmill right in the middle of it, because some folks might find that counter to some of the environmental objectives that make Bolinas what it is. But the community plan does highlight potential sites on the Bolinas Peninsula that are suitable for energy production. And this is importantly contingent on this infrastructure not adversely affecting other natural or man-made systems. And one spot in particular is actually right across the street, the sewer pond. And I did a little bit of research into this, and I'm not an environmental engineer, but I can say there are some research studies that show that having solar mixed with sewer ponds actually increases the functionality of those sewer ponds. And that could be a really great way to balance these environmental objectives, because the sewer ponds are the sewer ponds, and it perhaps would be less controversial for folks to put solar on top of it, especially if it meant increasing the efficiency of those sewer ponds. So next slide. Thank you guys again. This is my presentation, and I would like to consider expanding services to include electricity, if you so please. Hopefully I made a compelling argument. Oh yeah, you guys do have any questions? Sorry, I almost forgot. I feel like it was kind of like a conversation at a lot of points. So that is an important thing though.
I was just gonna say that in today's San Francisco Chronicle, there was a big article about wave energy. And there's a town up in Oregon that has gone to wave energy and is now supplying electricity for their town with some technology that's just been developed within the last, I think, 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
But reading the description of where the town was and the kind of coastline, it seemed like it was just like us.
Yeah.
And I
I
just
love that
thought
idea.
throw that out there, because if we're gonna talk about this, which I think we are, that's another one to be considered, considering that the ocean is right there and it's sort of a perpetual motion machine.
Yeah.
So, anyway, I just wanted to throw that out, but
And do you think that that would be exclusive to Bolinas, or that could be something shared with Stinson?
yeah, I would think it could, huh? Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are different kinds of waves that had to do with whether you dealt with the waves as they move through the ocean or the ones that break, but apparently they got some good technology and they had a breakdown on how much it costs per whatever, and it was very efficient.
Mhm.
So, it seems like this is something we would be interested in talking about. Would you all agree with that?
Yeah.
So what
Sweet.
is the next thing that we would do?
Oh, okay. Well, first, I want to comment on the wave thing. I think that's a really great creative way. And I'm curious to see what the intermittency issues are with wave energy, especially because, you know, people surf year round here. And I'm wondering if that would reduce the storage requirements because it would be a bit more consistent. So that's definitely exciting to look into. And I am also curious about the costs. I can, you know, write up a quick one-page summary report and send it to you if you're interested.
Please.
And there's a lot of different ways to get very creative about how to develop this infrastructure. And I just wanted to comment on that as well. Like my dad and I were talking about just different kind of sci-fi fantasy ideas. And we were talking about this way to like pump the water up the dam. And then like in periods where there's like peak production, and then when there's low production, you can use the water that's been raised as like a battery and let it come down so you can regenerate hydroelectric. So definitely if we put our minds together, I think we can come up with solutions that are more creative than the wind and solar arguments that I was making. It's just that those are the typical conventional ways of producing renewable power, but certainly I want to hold the door open for creative emerging technologies like wave and like the ones my dad and I have been twiddling our thumbs over.
So let's assume then that this board is interested in pursuing what you're suggesting, and you know, which has been a subject of discussion in this town for a long time anyway. About taking electricity away from PG&E and
Oh, yeah.
taking control of it. So what would you recommend is the next step in the process?
Yeah. I actually had a very interesting conversation with the Jefferson Public Utilities District for the case study that I just gave. And I think the first concern I had was like, is this even possible at our scale? And they were telling me that, you know, they had just 8 people on their utility board when they were able to pull off this transition. And they had a lot of veterans, so to speak, from making this transition happen. And they all said that they would be very happy to come in and talk to you guys about how to make this possible. So
I think we would definitely be interested in hearing from them.
yeah,
So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Sounds like,
Yeah.
you know,
I love to hear that. And then in terms of, so those are the experts, because they've done it before and they've made it happen. But coming from me to give you a more immediate answer, I think the first step and the most feasible step is to expand the services. So the generating of the infrastructure is the next step, but first you want to be able to actually own and govern those services. So that would require declaring eminent domain on PG&E systems here. And the state would come up with a cost estimate of how much that is. And the rural utility service grants for those and loans for those things are very reasonable. They're very low interest rates and they're long-term loans. But more research would need to be done, and you would need to work directly with them to figure out how much that would work. So there would need to be some lawyers involved, I'm assuming, to figure out how eminent domain could be declared. And I think that Jefferson County Public Utilities District could clarify the steps for how that could be done. I'm going to be around. I just finished my work up in Portland, and I'm back in Marin, and I'm definitely happy to figure this out because it's super cool to me. So I can definitely keep coming if you guys are interested and help
I bet
guide you through this.
On committee?
It's not in your hand.
but, oh, sorry, Jeannie,
Oh, I think,
are you on mute?
is it okay if I click on the comment?
Oh, yeah, sure, that's.
She says, loving that I caught this amazing presentation and sorry I need to go to another Zoom meeting.
Oh, no, that's somebody else. That's somebody
Wendy,
else.
yeah, so
Thank
Jeannie's
you.
got her hand up. you wanna,
Yeah,
Bell?
I think she's on mute.
yeah, I've got it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Turn up a little.
Barely.
Just
Great, great. I know, it's always barely, so I will speak up. I mean, this is thrilling. This is the first full Georgia Wood meeting I've been able to attend due to very personal things. But what you're telling us is so exciting. So what is like a work plan? Let's get a work plan. Starting with inviting the Jefferson County folks to come and talk to us and seeing what your role would be, et cetera. But also I was wondering about, like, I've been considering trying to get us solar powered or whatever is appropriate for us. I think solar would be it. Could that be an element that could be, I want to call it beefed up for locals, for residents to help us in the meanwhile, while you're working through all of these bigger issues like getting the eminent domain, doing all the legal things, to let people know that they could help individually at their homes and to find out and to help them find out what help is available for them to do that. So I would just like to see that as part of what you're very exciting presentation.
Thank you.
Really excellent.
That enthusiasm means a lot to me.
Yeah,
I think to answer your question about how local people can participate in making this transition happen by installing solar on their residence, it sounds like that's your question. I will say that primarily happens by investing your own finances in installing that solar. However, I will note that I think that there is an information gap in terms of the resources available for low-income residents in installing solar on their residences, because there's a bunch of solar programs that support people who are low income to install renewable energy on their homes. But according to the California Distributed Generation statistics, none of those programs have been taken advantage of in this zip code. So I think that to answer that question, to motivate the local community into installing renewable energy onto their residences, that would need to happen either if they could afford it on their own, but if they are eligible, there should be some work done on addressing that information gap to help motivate those who are low income in installing solar on their residences as well. I think that work would benefit this project greatly. Yeah.
Grace has her hand up.
This just seems to me like a place where the Bolinas community group could loop in terms of finding out this information, providing it out to the residents. It's like, there are these programs available, this is how you do it. I don't know that they're meeting in December, but it seems like, I've got solar on my house. I was really completely surprised to find out how well it was working, because I thought, oh, it's foggy all the time, this is ridiculous, why am I doing this? And it's like amazing. And that's partly because I did not educate myself, for sure. But I think that, as you say, if there are indeed programs that are not being utilized, that could be, the Bolinas community group seems like a really good spot to help get that information out, as well as the hearsay, as well as maybe next door. I'm not a next door person, but, having them involved in the conversation seems like a very useful information vector.
There's sort of two things you're talking about. I think one of them is what you're saying, which
Yes.
is the community involvement and education and
Kind of
participation.
in the meantime,
Yeah,
while this other bigger
but
thing.
the other one is
Yeah.
that for the BPUD in particular, as a public utility district, actually getting involved and taking over providing electricity to the community as a utility, which is not something I think that would be done by the community at large, but by this district.
Correct.
So they're sort of on parallel tracks.
Parallel tracks, yeah.
Absolutely.
I will note though that, because I don't believe I answered your initial question as concisely as I could have, the first step would need to be put it on a ballot, so the community can vote on whether or not they want this. So it would need to be a proposition about whether or not BPUD can and will expand their services to electric. That's how it was done in Jefferson, actually. They put it on a proposition and then the community voted it in. And if BPUD is interested in making this happen, I think having a community workshop with the Venus community programs would be very important, because I would not be surprised if PG&E tried to do a counter campaign like they've done in almost every other situation where a public utility has expanded to include electricity. And that counter campaign can be rigorous. I mentioned on my slide, they did like robocalls, they did like truck billboards, they did door-to-door knocking, they even created an AstroTurf organization in the community. And it was pretty intense, and it's kind of surprising that it's not illegal. So the first thing, though, to answer your question, would be to get it passed on a proposition within the local community. And I think that those two things could be done at the same time, perhaps, like have a community meeting on, hey, we need to address the fact that we're not on target to reduce our emissions, and here are some steps to do that within our electricity grid. And we can do that both on the person-to-person level with installing solar on our residences, but we can also do it by expanding BPUD to include electric services. So I mean, that might be a lot for some folks to receive in one meeting, but certainly I think a targeted initiative on both of those fronts would be necessary.
I'm still saying you could have two separate meetings. And you think that you could help coordinate somebody, one or more people from the Jefferson Utility District to appear at this meeting on Zoom to
Yeah.
talk to us about how they got started and things of that nature?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would be very honored to help coordinate that and participate seriously in any way. I think, I have some free time. I'm a college grad. I'm kind of, flying kites, kicking rocks,
Yeah.
Board,
So, and this is definitely
Especially
a.
if we're gonna expand from 5 to 8.
Oh.
right? You said
Yeah,
8
yeah.
or 8, yeah.
Oh, I see. You already.
Oh, yeah, no, I zeroed it.
So among other things, I'd like to suggest then that we put this on the agenda for the next meeting and have someone from the Jefferson, what's the name of their district?
Jefferson County, Public Utilities District. Mhm.
To make a presentation to us on, how they did it basically, and how they got started. What do you think about that?
Yeah.
Great, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah,
I'd like to know, like, their recommendations for first steps. I'd like a little bit of an overview,
yeah,
but I'd also like step 1.
Yeah.
step 2, step 3.
yeah, give us a
And then-
game plan.
Then we can go.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and to the extent that there's community involvement on another level, which is participating and getting things going and looking for grants and help,
Mhm.
that's available also. We do have a civic group that meets once a month to talk about that, but for our board, it would be getting started with, sounds like a ballot initiative.
Yeah.
Sometimes we do things on what's called an advisory poll.
Mhm.
Where we simply put it on the ballot and ask people, are you supportive of this or not? But it sounds like maybe it has to be a little more official than that, but
Hmm.
we'll find out, but we can do that. So,
Yeah.
George, you want to coordinate that with her and put it on the agenda and set up somebody to make a Zoom appearance?
I just want to say that, in a month that has not been politically quite as much as I might have wanted.
Yeah.
This feels pretty exciting.
It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, I also want to say, oh, sorry, go ahead. Are you talking? I'm sorry.
When I was, when the whole election thing happened and I was kind of thinking about the state of our country and how we're ever gonna agree on anything. And then reading your thesis was like this guy, Manker Olson.
Yes.
Saying how like the larger the group, the less it will further its common interest, and then kind of how you tied in the community plan of like, we're gonna get it done if we do it ourselves.
Yeah.
Like, I think that might be a way to rally other places. It's like,
Yeah.
look, we're not gonna get 330 million people to agree that climate change is a thing, we're gonna fix it. Like, if we, in this very small, like, nature loving town, can like just say, hey, we're gonna like start doing things to be the model. And it's gonna be really frustrating and hard, but we're gonna pave the way and figure it out. And then once we do that, other places can be like, well, they did it,
Yeah.
Jefferson County did it.
Yeah.
So I do like this, like, kind of, let's just go for it and let's aim big, whether it's like moving the town up to the Mesa or starting an electrical grid, or, vaccinating, testing people for COVID. So I thought it was a great presentation. I'm really excited about this in general. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to have any comments on it?
I mean, it's exciting to see a daughter of Belena's come back with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well thought out, a really thoughtful presentation. I thought you really nailed it, so it was really nice to see.
You know.
Thank you. I really
Kirsten,
appreciate that.
No, I would echo that.
Here,
That's
here.
great. I did have one question, the Jefferson community, how large a community is that? Is it comparable to Bolinas?
It's actually a lot bigger than Venus.
Okay,
And they do not have their own internal in-house power generation. So they work with the Bonneville Power Administration in Washington to secure their power. But because Bolinas is smaller, I think it's possible that we can do it all locally because our consumption is lower.
Yeah.
And then to your point about the logic of collective action, I think it's also important to note the cultural capital that Bolinas has. Whenever I go anywhere outside of California, I'm always shocked to find that people know Bolinas. I was in Costa Rica recently in like the most remote place imaginable. And I was talking to this older guy and he's like, oh, I love Bolinas. I used to always come to the Labor Day parades. And I was like, how? You know? And this is a great way to, I think, inspire other people in California. I included on my thesis, I didn't bring it into this presentation, but some of the ways that Bolinas is comparable to other California communities and also the rest of the United States. And I think that, yeah, serving as like, hey, this is pretty cool, you guys, environmentalism rocks, like could be a way to kind of, you know, get the ball rolling for other communities as well.
Have you talked to Peter Lucchetti? You know who that is?
I don't actually.
He lives in town and he is like a huge infrastructure guy. He was like really instrumental in marine clean energy.
Yeah.
And I know I've talked to him about getting our own dedicated solar system here. And so he might be someone that you can talk to.
Yeah,
I can
definitely.
introduce you or let the staff let you know who he is.
Yeah, I'd love that. I think I had an interesting conversation with the people from Marin Clean Energy because I wasn't certain whether or not it would be necessary for Bolinas to expand, I mean, for BCPUD to expand their services, because there already was Marine Clean Energy. But the interesting thing about Marine Clean Energy, or I don't know why I'm saying Marin Clean Energy, is that due to their bundled sourcing of renewable energy credits, it doesn't actually encourage new renewable energy infrastructure. So that's definitely a reason to do it in Bolinas, because if BCPUD had control over their electric services, that could encourage this additional generation of renewable energy, which I think Marin Clean Energy currently does not do.
All right, well, I think we got an agenda to deal with, so.
Yeah.
No, this is very good. I think that it's something that we're excited to get into, and we will. So we'll put it on the agenda. We'll set up hopefully a communication with people at Jefferson, and we'll be in touch.
Sweet. All right. Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much again for your time. This was really fun.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that meeting is when December.
I was looking at
I think I-
Is that great, Brad?
December 11th.
11th.
December 11th.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like tomorrow.
Okay.
What's that?
It seems like it.
I just want
Yeah, that might be ambitious. It's New Year.
Isabel, the next meeting is December 11th. That's when we'll be here. We bumped it up a week to avoid the holiday rush. So if we can get on the agenda and if we can get somebody from Jefferson, that would be probably the time.
Awesome.
seems kind of tight.
If
But-
if not, obviously, the next month.
Yeah.
Cool.
I mean, yeah,
Right, if
it
it
could just be, I mean, this isn't gonna happen overnight, this project, so, you know, if we get them to come on in December and, you know, talk to us for half an hour and get some information then, I think that'd be great,
That
but.
way you've been this, I'm gonna send it around to everybody too. It's really interesting.
Sweet, sweet. And thank you so much.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll, you said the Marin.
Civic group,
Yeah.
Bolinas Civic
Marin
Group.
Civic Group, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll test the waters, the next presentation, with, the Jefferson people and you guys again. And then if it seems like the logical next step, I can certainly talk to the Bolinas Civic Group as well. Yeah. And then quick follow-up question though about contacting the Jefferson people. They had a wonderful local activist who was not a part of their public utilities district. I believe his name is Bill Wise, who was very instrumental in pushing their utility service expansion. And I was wondering if it's okay to have him come perhaps, or if you want people from the utilities
No.
district.
Whoever you think would be the most beneficial for
Okay,
us.
sweet.
Yeah,
All right.
You should
Will
go
do.
by, you should go by the school too. If
Yeah?
anyone wants to see it, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
all right.
Yeah, thank you guys
Thank you
again.
very
This is
much.
so- Yeah.
Let's go.
Thank you.
Do we need to move up, Nick?
Yeah, I said, I mean, as long as we're moving things up,
Yeah.
I would say let's keep on that roll. There's, the residential permit parking plan committee, and I believe that, I saw
Yeah.
Bruce, at least,
And Sherry.
and Sherry are here to, present on that, so maybe we can move them up. And then also, Nick, I believe, is here too. So maybe we can give them.
All right.
And we don't have anything from Sherry and Bruce.
They were gonna give a verbal,
Okay.
update, is my understanding.
They have waited so many hours.
Yes.
In this meeting, let's.
Okay, so are we taking that item 7 and moving it up?
Yes, number 7.
Okay, and is there another one besides that you also wanted to?
Yeah,
advance?
number, item 22.
Yes, 20, item 23, sorry, when you said numbering got a little messed up, but it's item
Number
23.
23, all right, so we're going to do item 7 next, and then we'll do 23.
Express.
All right, so I'm now going to call item 7 on our agenda, which is the resident permit parking plan committee. And we have Sherry and Bruce.
Yes.
One of you like to make a presentation?
Yeah, it'll be, it's really an update from last month, and we'll try and make it quick. I just want to say that, that in October, the most important bit of information is that in October, the Board of Supervisors passed the ordinances that drive the change. And they were the vehicle length restriction ordinance and the permit restriction. They also approved the MOU between BPUD and the Sheriff's Office to give out the permits, to administer the permit program. There was a traffic resolution that was part of the presentation to the Board of Supervisors, but it was pulled because it needed revision. And since the board voted and on 10/29 was the vote for all of this. And then on 10/30, we received the revised revision, but it still wasn't quite right. And so since then, until just about today, we've been working on it with the Department of Public Works and also the Sheriff's Office has been pretty involved in all of this. What the issue was basically was centered on Wharf Road, because Wharf Road wasn't as well defined like Brighton Avenue has been in terms of where the location of the restrictions would be exactly. So that needed to be worked out, and what the county had shown was restrictions exceeding what we understood they were to be and the area they were to be, and didn't match quite what the Coastal Commission submission looked like. So that needed to be straightened out. And then we also wanted to confirm for Wharf Road what the enforcement of the 20-foot, 2-foot vehicle length restriction would be. That how it would affect the local boating community, you know, the commercial fishermen and the people associated with the Rod and Boat Club, etc. So that took a while. It took a while to get
Back and forth.
Yeah, get to the end. And I just want to recap what the ordinances are that are going to be detailed in the resolution. And these are what's being presented is exactly what the Coastal Commission submission was. It went through a lot of review, and so it's nothing really new. For Brighton, the permit restriction is on the residential side of the street. It starts with the property just past the Presbyterian Church. to Cliff Road, and the restriction is from 2 AM to 5 AM. The 22-foot vehicle length restriction is on the other side of the street where the park is, starting at, Olima Bolinas Road. And it goes to Park. And that is 11 PM to 5 AM, matching what Measure X restrictions are. And essentially it's a Measure X restriction, but it's has a specific vehicle length restriction. Now on Wharf Road, the permit restriction is on the land side, starting with the barn, which is next to the museum. And then it goes to the last property on the inlet side of Wharf Road. It stops there, and the area from number 86 Wharf to the beach is left without permit restriction. That's necessary because the people who live on the lagoon have red zones in front of their properties. They have no place to park. And also because we don't have visitor permits, there's no place for them to go to the other side of the street, which is what the answer has been for Brighton Avenue. So that's what happens with the permit. For the vehicle length restriction, we first wanted to confirm how it would work with the, the local boating community. And we had some help from local folks on that, and who are in the boating community. And we confirmed with the sheriff and DPW that if the boats are if the boat and the trailer are not coupled together, they won't count it as one. They won't ticket it basically. But the vehicle and the trailer would need to be 22 feet, no greater than 22 feet. So that was information that was very helpful to, for people to know. And of course, it'll be helpful to tell them going forward, uncouple your boat from your trailer. Then the other thing is they were deviating a bit from the Coastal Commission where the area was for the 22-foot restriction. And we asked that they stay with what was shown, which was exactly the same thing as the permit restriction shows. On the lagoon, I did not tell you what it showed on the lagoon side. The lagoon side, the permit restriction and the vehicle length restriction affect two properties, the two sort of adjacent to the dock going towards the center of town, number 73 and number 75. There is no permit restriction beyond that point, nor is there a 22-foot vehicle length restriction, because everything beyond that point is red zone. The only area that's not red is the area surrounding the Rod and Boat Club. And initially they had shown the vehicle length going there, but since that had never shown up in any of the conversations or documents, and it never was part of Measure X, we determined that at this point it was not, and we really didn't know whether, that community would accept it because they've never had anything there. So they are not part of it at this point. Now, if the community, we found out really confirmed today that if there is a problem with, large vehicles, and then we don't have a huge number of them really coming into town, but they do come sometimes. If there turns out to be a problem with that, which one member of that community was concerned about, the traffic resolution can be amended, it can be modified, it can be added to. They had developed this new system with their ordinances so to provide the flexibility. So right now, what we have here looks just like what it looked like on the submission to the Coastal Commission, the maps look the same. And so the next step is to go to put together the revision, send it to us to take a look at. We'll send you, the board can take a look at it. People, the map is really the easiest thing to read. The resolution itself is a little difficult to read, but the map shows it. And we had hoped it would go in November. It's not going November. It's not going December. It's going to the board sometime in January because of the holidays. So that's where we're at.
That's good.
We're at.
Thank you. Sounds like you're moving right along.
Nice work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, Sherry, you, I know in particular, and Bruce have gone above and beyond to communicate, because I've been on some of those threads, so I really appreciate your due diligence here. And the map, again, like Kevin, I'm a visual person, so I think that map, when you have that, sounds like it hasn't changed, but, or it may need to be updated. If you would be able to provide it to us for maybe the next meeting, that would be helpful.
Yeah, and well, the map, I got a note back from DPW. I want to say that the staff there have really been very helpful to try and get it done. I mean, they would answer every question. Then we had to negotiate with the sheriff, and they went in and, said, okay, yes, you can do this. All right, but they kept doing. So today he said, yeah, I'm going to send it back to you to take a look at. We're working on it right now. As soon as I get it, I will send it to BPUD to be circulated to the board, which should be in the next few days. They're ready to be done with it. Let me tell you.
We all are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody else?
But they were really, they've been very supportive, and I think it's good to try and have this relationship with them, since they control a lot of what goes on in the street. And
Out.
All right, anybody else want to speak to this subject? Otherwise, I guess we'll just wait for the January meeting, and hopefully it finally gets signed off, and at some point, the BPUD's going to be asked to start issuing the permits, I assume.
Right.
yeah, in fact, BPUD, they think that BPUD, I was mentioning this earlier to Bell, they think that they can start kind of putting it together now, because the MOU has been not issuing, obviously, but they can start putting it, the system together now, working with the sheriff, because the MOU's been signed off on, and the ordinance has been signed off on. So this is just a formality, basically, of where it is going to go. So I'm just letting you know what they've said, and I think Bell knows, we talked about it earlier, so.
Yeah, we'll just start putting the pieces together of what this is gonna look like, so that we're ready to roll as soon as we can.
And to that end, I just want to say there are a lot of parking spaces missing on Wharf Road towards the beach because of the condition of the road, and they've cordoned off part of the road, and they put no parking signs for about 8 to 10, starting, past the biolab a bit. And so we're gonna want to see Wharf Road start a little later on the permit, because people can't handle more restriction there right now. So,
So I live downtown, and I haven't walked Wharf Road that often of late. I'm embarrassed to say, but I know a lot's going on. Sherry's had her eye on everything and worked all the nuances out with the county, and I think it's going to be a great plan, and this is something really beneficial for the community going forward. We got a lot of problems worked out in terms of visitation and parking. So thanks.
We've been talking about it for years, so it's just great that we're getting there.
yeah,
right.
thank you for your support for it.
Yeah, you're welcome. We're ready to move on to the next item. Okay, thank you.
All
Okay,
right. Good night.
good night.
Well, stay safe.
All right, then I'm gonna call item 20.
Can I just
Sorry,
Oh.
to ask one.
Oh, go ahead, yeah.
But, I did bring this up to, I think Belle and Georgia. It's like, do we know what's, and you don't have to answer it now, but I would love to get it on the agenda for our next meeting. What's happening with Wharf Road and the county and the FEMA money?
Yeah, I mean, I
Just
reported
know
out
that.
on it in August, and that was basically the last that I heard. And essentially, that was, I mean, you were at that meeting, but just to reiterate, essentially, they lost their FEMA funding, and so there is no grand plan to even, you know, I mean, I'd say grand in quotations, because obviously people recognize that all of the road is basically problematic. We deal with it on the infrastructure side, right? And really their very big project was to address a small portion of the road, and that's basically falling through.
Is
And
that
now
why they lost their funding?
yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly why they lost their funding. I don't think they fully know, except that, essentially people down there started to communicate with FEMA and say, hey, this has been a long-standing issue. And they were really tying it to a specific, the reason that it was FEMA eligible is that it was, tied to a specific storm event in the 2022, I believe. And essentially FEMA started to dig, well, figuratively dig into the issue, and we're like, could corroborate that this, you know, preceded, the 2022 storms. So that basically meant that, you know, they weren't gonna have that money, and now they are going to address that very problematic region with a much more like a kind of Band-Aid solution, where they're gonna do some kind of fill. I don't know, I can reach back out to, the engineer who, you know, I was communicating when that whole thing happened, we were gonna have to move our main, and obviously we were much more involved, like us personally, BPUD, with how the wharf project was moving forward, because it was impacting, us directly. But, you know, I'm happy to reach back out and just say, hey, what's, you know, when is that kind of smaller version of that gonna happen? I think I'll talk about it later in my manager's report, because in terms of like the weeks that we were dealing with on work, maybe we can talk about it again then.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously concerned that, if it was communicated back to FEMA that this has been a long-standing issue and it resulted in losing the funding, because we want to keep Coastal Commission and the county as much invested in downtown Wharf Road and supporting that infrastructure as much as possible.
Yes.
So, I would work with Sherry, and maybe some of the other people on Wharf Road to make sure that we all are clear on, you know, what the strategy is and how we communicate.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
So we have number 23.
Moving on to item 23. This is a request for financial relief from quarterly meter bill pursuant to resolution 553 for the property at 85 Olinas Road, Nick Civits for Starboot Farms. You hear?
Hey,
So,
you hear me?
there you go.
Yeah.
We can. So we had a letter describing the leak. Sounds
Yes.
like under the house or under the ground, and you didn't know about it until the water leaked enough to surface, at which point you fixed it. Is that right?
That's correct. And it was in the front yard, in between the house and the meter. So it's a small stretch. There may be 30 feet total. So it was right in that little area.
Okay. Let me see. I mean, it's pretty straightforward problem and not unlike other ones that we've had. Does anybody have any questions to ask Nick about this?
I have two questions.
Sure.
One's for Belle. Belle, do we, I'm looking at the 4-year water usage, if it is less than 100 cubic feet per quarter, does it round down? Because there's some months or some quarters with no usage. I'm just wondering what.
Yeah, so if they use like 50 cubic feet, we just, you know, we start with 100 cubic feet and we go in those numbers. So if it's 50, I usually just do it as 0, and then it'll kind of catch it up next time around.
And then I guess my second question is, did one of our operators or several of our operators like investigate the trench and the pipe?
Not that I know of. Val, do you know?
I'm not, no, I don't, I think they did go down there at one point to check it out, but I don't know if they've checked it out since it was repaired.
I have pictures too. I can send. I sent some.
Yeah. I'm just, I don't distrust you at all, Nick, so don't get that impression, but I'm just wondering if there's a policy for our operators to like check things out, just so that we know that what the customer is indeed reporting is true, because you know, someone could be nefarious and sort of fill up this thing and say, oh no, it's this pipe that leaked, and we.
Well, I mean, what about like a plumbing report or what are you know, assuming, I mean, I don't know what is the kind of most appropriate way? Cause like, do you want them to investigate, okay, yes, we concur that this leak is where you said it
Yeah.
was, we concur that you actually fixed it, like.
I don't know, I just was wondering if it's our policy to have someone from our staff check.
But it's not,
Often,
it's on the homeowner's
Yeah.
side.
It's been in the past, because
Yeah.
we usually, a lot of times, people don't do it themselves, and so we get the, you know,
Yeah.
we get the plumber's bill, you know, or a statement from the plumber saying what they've done. The fact that Nick fixed it himself, I mean, I think that's kind of great.
Yeah.
I have to say,
Yeah, I get what you're
impressed.
saying, but
Yeah.
that hasn't been what we've done in the past.
Okay.
I
But usually-
did have them reread the meter. Actually, to be honest, I didn't double check it because it was a couple of days ago and I wanted to make sure, but I lost that thread. So that's often things we'll do, is just make sure that it's not leaking anymore. That's generally what we do.
Yeah, that was my question, Nick. You know, I appreciate your letter and it seems like you're on top of it. You mentioned that you've been sort of monitoring it since then, but are you reading your meter regularly? Because if you can't see a leak, that's the only way to really know if there is a leak, is if your meter is spinning. Have you, are you? able to-
I check it occasionally, but usually it's more visual for us because we have, you know, I'm over there a couple times a week or whatever, and then we have a crew that's cleaning.
I mean, I guess the lesson is it's not always a visual, like a visual inspection won't always tell you if there's a leak. Really the only way to see it sometimes is with a meter reading. And this is something that's come up here with other properties. You know, they make these sort of smart meters that will send you a text message if it detects a leak or if it thinks there's a leak. So there are ways to discover them even beyond the visual inspection, which doesn't always give you. So you know, we've sort of requested that people put these in. We don't demand it, but we request that people do it. If
Yeah, it's a good idea. You're talking about the smart meters there, is that right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
So, you know, I would love for you to look into that. It would give you some more information, especially because it seems like this house isn't being used often. So, you know, it sort of gives you peace of mind.
Yeah, no, it's a great idea.
It sort of leads me to another thought, which maybe Jack can clarify, or Georgia. You know, I'm happy to consider leak relief this time, but if it happens again, I would be less inclined. You know, especially if you don't take the advice to do a smart meter. So, what is our policy on if this happens again? Do we consider it again, or is it sort of a one-time deal?
Well, if it's the same problem, then we're not as forgiving.
Yeah.
Because also one of the things is we say simply, turn everything off in your house that uses water, and then go look at your meter. And if it's still running with no water on in the house, then you've got a leak somewhere, you
Yeah.
know? So it's a very straightforward way of finding out right away if you got it. So if people don't bother to do that, then we're not as sympathetic when they.
Yeah, so I just wanted to get that to you as well, Chris. Or sorry, Nick.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's understandable.
All right.
Go ahead, Grace.
Oh, just the name of one brand of the smart meters is Flume, Flume.
Okay.
About $200, I think, and real easy to install.
Okay.
I'm sure there may be other ones out there. That's just the one that I know about, but just kind of an FYI. And
Great.
they send you, there's an app on your phone, so it's nice to just, then you kind of really don't have to think.
Yeah,
about it.
peace of mind. That's great. I will look into that. Thank you. for the
You got a
advice.
lot going on down there, and you know, the last thing you want to worry about is whether you're.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right, well, does anybody on the board want to make a motion on granting this request for relief? And if so, what's the recommendation? Normally, I would say on one of these, I think that we used to be pretty 100% about it, but I think now our policy is 90%.
Yeah.
So that's would be the suggested motion that I'm throwing out there. You get a 90% reduction, and I would start at the base rate, so it wouldn't be at those higher rates.
I have someone.
Yeah, Belle, it's true. I think the way that it maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically we look at average use, assume that they would be using that over the period and then 90%. Is that not correct?
Yes, we figure out what their average use is and deduct that from the whole amount of the leak, and then 90% of whatever's remaining. But their average use is really small, so that it's the majority of it will be 90%.
All right,
I have someone.
okay, is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, 5-0. All right, so we will send you a revised bill for a substantially less amount.
Great. Thank you very much.
Right,
Thanks.
Thanks, Nick.
okay, and with that, Georgia,
You did a good job with this letter and outlined everything. for the next
we're gonna
meeting.
go back
What's
to,
that?
I just thought he wrote a good letter.
Oh, yeah.
Like, really
It
appreciate
gave us all the information.
But I do think it's like a good idea that standardized of like, okay, what is the
We all read it.
supportive documentation
Mhm.
Right.
to like ensure. that-
yeah, it's just most of the time, I wouldn't say most of the time, but many times the customer will simply provide a copy of their plumber's bill.
Yes.
You know,
Makes sense.
Oh, I actually have one more question, not necessarily for Nick, but maybe more for Belle and Georgia. I noticed somewhere in there, I think maybe his repair notes that he replaced his line with a, matching 3/4 inch supply line. I'm just wondering if that's common for properties in Bolinas, because I think I have a 5/8 and, if you think about it, it's, 15% less water going through my pipe, which would theoretically mean 15% less of a leak, total gallons. So I'm just wondering if you guys know what the average size is, if that's large or if that's standard, because.
That's, I think 5/8 is 3/4 essentially is what I've been told. Even though they're not exactly the same, that's kind of considered the same size.
Oh, okay.
But I can check with the guys.
Yeah, I don't know, sorry.
Okay.
all right, then I'm gonna go back up to item 1 on our agenda, manager's update.
Okay, thank you. So I'm gonna start with the water supply memo here. I know I've talked about paring this down, but actually it's a little more interesting now, and so this is not the opportune time to do that, I think. But basically, and just to let you know, I mean, this is obvious, but I was sick last meeting. Thank you, Belle, for doing an outstanding job running the meeting. And I appreciate all your guys' well wishes and happy to be back here. But basically, this is like 2 months worth of data where I'll be focusing on obviously what happened in October. But at the end of, as of the end of October, the district had received 0.62 inches of rain since July 1st. That's the beginning of the rain year, which is slightly below the historical average of 0.75 inches by the end of October. And we received 0.07 inches of rain in September, and 0.049 inches of rain in October. Just looking at, this again, I'm sure you guys are very familiar with this, but this is just starting to get interesting, right? This is basically using our current rain totals to predict what we'll have at the end of the year. As I've been saying the last several months, because we have no rain in, August, September, and because we don't predict any rain in August, September, this was very uninteresting, and basically we were predicting average rainfall for the year. But now we're right in that point where we're, you historically start to get some rain, and it's like, are we maintaining that sort of what we would predict at this point in time? So right now, we are basically predicting slightly below average, because as of October, at the end of October, we were slightly below what we would expect to get at that point in time. Obviously, it's raining out here, so all of this could change November, and it likely will. But just to kind of, point out, we are essentially of the 73 historical years on record that we have that go into this model, we're basically 81% of those years are above what we had, at the end of October. And then looking at our creek flows here, again, much of this model is really informed by rain. And so essentially you can, and those are, signified by these little gray blips. But basically, we're looking at a model of 84,556 gallons per day flowing by the end of October. That's, and again, we're on this like downward slope, right? Where essentially we're getting less and less rain and getting further and further away from when the last heavy rains occurred. And so the flow is going down. And basically we're now, in this 84,000 gallon per day model. Like, again, this is a model of what we had at the end of October, and we can look into November and say, okay, worst case scenario, assuming we got no rain in November, we're getting rain now, we can see that that would be a really bad assumption, right? But basically we could get as low as 72. But again, this model, hopefully I'll come back next month and we'll see that all of this has changed because essentially we're starting to get rain. Just to point out though, with these decreased flow rates, we had to supplement supply with diversion from Wood Rat 1 reservoir for 5 days in mid-October. That was just, it seems like eons ago, but that was that heat wave that we had. And essentially that, I was talking to Stu about it today, and he was talking about how it's basically this double whammy, right? With the heat, you essentially have, the flows are actually pretty dynamic in terms of when there's a lot of heat, then essentially the, trees are sucking in groundwater, and you're getting less flow into the creek. At the same time that's happening, people are like, it's hot out, I'm going to, water my flowers or whatever. So basically we had to go on Wood Rat 1 for 5 days. Just to spell out what that actually means is we have 4 filters that are producing filtered water. It's a potable water. And basically one of those, when we're using Wood Rat 1, is going, filtering water off of Wood Rat 1. It's really hard on the filters. It's not ideal. But ultimately what that means is all of that converges into a single pipe that, is going to the tanks. So even though we're, the water quality is poorer on Wood Rat 1, it's harder on our filters, it's not, ideal. But ultimately when we're, sending that water to the town, it's actually not even 1/4 because it's not produced as efficiently even. But basically, it's the water quality. We didn't get a lot of complaints about it or anything, but it is something that we let people know, hey, we're on Wood Rat 1, so you might have noticed some messages that went around that time. One other point to make. Basically, there's a couple of conditions under which we use reservoir water. The one that I just described, which is obviously very intuitive, we have less water, we're looking for other sources. The other way, which is basically if the creek becomes too turbid and we can't produce water from there, then we're looking at Wood Rat 1 for our water. So, it's something that we effectively plan for these storms. So they essentially produce a lot of water in anticipation of the storm, filled our tanks up, and we're kind of like, can we get through these next few days of the storm? And then, hopefully things die down. And if there are kind of moments of like clarity, then we can start producing from the arroyo, fill up if, to anticipate the next kind of storm. So obviously though, if we have to use Wood Rat 1, we'll go on Wood Rat 1. I'll get to this in a sec, but basically one thing to keep in mind is that we're in this slightly precarious position because we're kind of, we are on a single tank right now because of the tank site project. And so that kind of impacts our ability to sort of use the tanks as a buffer to kind of get through these periods when, production is not ideal. Okay, so then turning now to our has to be colorful slide here. So production in October, in the district was, 84,616 gallons per day. This is down from September's production, which averaged 96,033. Water consumption in October is 84,616.
Wow.
Yeah, it was perfectly matched, and I have to tell you, like, I looked at these numbers and I'm like, there's just random numbers going in here, so I felt like that was pretty exciting. I've not seen that happen before. Yes, yeah. Anyways, and that worked out to 145 gallons per day per connection. This is down from September's consumption, which worked out to around 170 gallons per day per connection. One point to make about these production and consumption, obviously we produce to match consumption. We've had, I'll get to this later, but some pretty big leaks, which obviously make production and consumption look like they're higher. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's like, it doesn't hugely impact, a gallon per day number, because you're averaging in for the whole month. But just to point out, when we had a big leak, there was some really massive, water loss. Okay, and then just honing in on this November 10th to 20th, we had, and I think that spans the really huge leak that I was talking about. So basically this number is, a lot, it's not really reflecting what people were using in town, and is really, is, because I'm looking at that smaller tranche where that leak happened, we are seeing, that's.
So you're saying it's inflated because of.
Yes. Which is like, I mean, it's still, consumption at some level, even if we're just basically dumping it in the ocean. Okay, and then this is basically, we finished, since I last showed you this graph, we finished out the 23-24 year. Just to remind you guys again, this is basically our real consumption. This is the meter reads and looking at, as we go through those tiered meter readings, and basically filling this graph out. We were talking about how, this cumulative consumption over the year looked like it was climbing back up from, the drought years where people really reduced. We're still obviously not up to, even probably historical average use. But we are climbing, and you can even see for, the first few tranches for this year, we're even climbing a little bit higher. So there is this trend towards, increased consumption in time. And again, this is actual consumption. I mean, obviously, if a leak's on the meter side, that, is contributing, but this is not, we have a leak on a main, this is go towards increased, consumption. All right, any questions on supply memo?
Yes, I'm just curious, is this an El Nino year, and does that get, do we have?
Models for
Yes.
this? I don't think we have, it doesn't factor into our model.
Okay.
I think it is an El Nino year,
La Nina, right?
or sorry, La Nina.
I don't know.
Which
No, I
is-
think it's La Nina,
Which
yeah,
is a drier cycle, right? Overall.
yes. I
A
think
drier cycle of a wet cycle?
No, like El Nino is supposed to be wetter
Heavy.
here, La Nina is drier, but I think
Oh.
it's also like when the rains come, they're like later, maybe in the year. I don't need to start to learn more about this.
And the last I was reading was, it was right on the, this was in the last couple of days, somewhere in New York Times or something, was saying it was kind of right on the cusp, like, they weren't calling it yet.
Yeah.
I saw
Okay.
that.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'm really sad that I lost, I brought this like physical thing in today. And that's maybe if you guys noticed during the earlier part of the meeting, I was like looking around. But basically I wanted to show you guys this was very exciting, but. Yes, so basically we've had lots of leaks, over the last, since the beginning of the year. I've been talking about these the whole time. They shifted from, being in the paved road, which obviously has an implication for cost. But we, also have had ones in dirt roads, which often are just more frequent. But either way, it's problematic. And just to reiterate, these leaks, especially this, you know, what I'm calling the massive wharf leak of 2024, is that, we're on a single tank. And so just to kind of anecdotally tell this story, Evan, you know, one of the things that they do is called like the daily run. They go and look and sort of, calculate consumption based on the difference between the tank levels plus some other numbers, right? And so basically, you know, he was like, wait, what? Because he was used to looking, first of all, that the measurement stick effectively would be at a certain point, and it wasn't there. And not only that, you could see it moving down. And so that was like his first experience with that, and it was like all hands on deck. And they then started to look around town for where this was. Ultimately, you know, it took some time, but they figured out pretty quickly that it was all on wharf. And the culprit was basically this, you know, large kind of bolt like thing that essentially acts as, there's like, you know, a repair on the main, there's a what is called a couple, and basically this thing is important for, you know, there's multiple of those that are kind of running around the couple and basically cinching that thing together and keeping that repair tight. And essentially this is what it should have looked like, and this is what it actually looked like, and this thing was only like 15 years old. So ultimately, from my perspective, very scary, because I think it's important to appreciate that it's like 15 years old is not that old in the scheme of our infrastructure. And I don't think that there was anything particularly special about this bolt, but it's more that it is in Wharf Road where there is just an inundation with seawater, and there's just like massive corrosion happening there. And like, what are we gonna do about it type of thing. I think one of the things that was really kind of also revealing and compelling was just when Stu was talking about repairing this was a Piazza job, and he was talking with the person, it was like, even when we address these types of leaks, it's like, we're not even putting in the infrastructure there that is appropriate necessarily, because we're doing it in an emergency, right? Like I was saying, like the tanks are going down, we're in this like high kind of crisis mode of like, are we gonna have to shut down water to the entire town because we don't, or like can't even provide water, right? We're gonna run out of water. And so it's like, let's get this thing fixed. But that's not the mode in which you're actually repairing this for like long-term viability of that repair, or even, you know, obviously ideally it would be like, hey, let's engineer this so that it's, you know, moved away from the seawater, or is coated in materials that will prevent corrosion. It's like basically like, let's get it fixed. But obviously, since I've been here, I don't even know. Now I'm coming up on a year in January. But I feel like in that single stretch of work, we've had probably like almost 6 repairs or something like that. So, and this is, you know, this last bullet point here is just kind of getting into the finances of it, which are, you know, beyond the, hey, can we provide water, is also like the financial side of this, like, this is scary, because basically, when I look at the 24-25 budget, we budgeted $70,000 toward, and granted, this is like kind of this broad bucket, which is basically emergency and contract services. So as an example, that would be the repair on Wharf Road, but some of the, you know, like the solar inverter where we're just like contracting with somebody new. And we don't have, you know, it's not like fully like that earmarked for that express thing. It's coming out of the same bucket. But regardless, it's like we have $70,000 in that bucket for the year. And we're already almost used 50,000. And we're not obviously halfway through the year. And then just to point out that then this is probably an underestimate because we haven't done all of the paving associated with those repairs, and that's a big chunk of the cost. But basically 37,000 of that has been paid towards Piazza. Primarily, that would be down at Wharf, but also we had, you know, a few other ones that have occurred along Mesa Road here, was the one back at the beginning of the summer, kind of right at Birch there. There's the one right here in front of the lab. Anyways, there's a lot of of these emergency repairs and how do we kind of approach this in a more rational way, so we're not just like plugging holes.
How do we?
I don't know, Jack.
I've been on this board a long time. That's the magic question.
No, I think, yeah,
Well, when Lyndon and was Lyndon and Mom who did the whole, and Jennifer who did the whole kind of survey of you know, what was going to be needed to be done and how we were gonna allocate money to do that.
Yeah,
The infrastructure projects, that's not the right term.
they
for
call it capital improvement.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Was Wharf kind of, did Wharf have a asterisk around it or anything, or was it just?
no, and I'd say, and I mean, this is kind of why I wanted to like do, I mean, we don't have the best documentation for this type of financial analysis. But it's something I'd like to work toward, but basically it's like, well, why didn't Wharf come out there? And I think that it's probably, some of it is like the daunting nature of it, you're just like, I can't hear Wharf. But other parts of it are like, we have a lot more leaks on, say, Birch Road. But how much do they cost, right? Because they're not as expensive because of these paving things. And to what extent, I mean, I talked about this more broadly in the capital improvement projects. It's like, can we come up with more objective kind of, you know, the sort of subjectivity of, oh, this sounds scary, or, oh, we deal with this all the time, like it's sort of removed from the equation and you kind of apply some sort of criteria, and then you basically run your little projects in the machine and it spits out, and it turns out you shouldn't even, who cares about Cedar? It's fine. I mean, it's like a nightmare, but whatever. It's like, focus your attention on the Wharf. You will spend $500,000 on that road over the next 5 years. And it is better for you to take out a bond or a loan to address that, because ultimately you will come up with an engineered solution where it's, you know, properly engineered for the site conditions of all of that. And ultimately you either pay for it in this Band-Aid approach where you keep paying for it for like ever, because things like this happen where this bolt degrades. Anyway, so I think that part of it too is like, we've been, as a district, very averse to loans, I'd say generally. And so if I look at the way that we fund CIP projects, it is through this sort of like, hey, we've got a bucket and we'll slowly like fill it up with these little cups of water until we have enough there, and then we'll do that project. But ultimately, some of what happens is like, oh, we had that bucket here, but then we needed to fix this repair. So like, it's like, we're not even filling it to the, you know, in this kind of slow incremental way that was planned. It's not even happening even that fast, right? Because we have other stuff that's like pulling us in other directions. Anyway, so sorry, I don't have like solutions. It's a little daunting to think about all of it, but I do think that we kind of like, we have to sort of bite the bullet on some of these bigger projects and just kind of.
yeah, I think this is the subject for the finance committee when you sit down to do the next budget, you know.
Yeah, it's kind of death by 1,000 cuts at this point, and
It is,
it makes more sense to me. I mean, it's gonna get nothing but more expensive to do any given project in the coming years, like nothing gets cheaper.
no,
right?
and every one of these little pieces is only gonna degrade further, they're not gonna get better.
Right,
So-
it seems to me like,
We're just waiting for the next little bolt to fail.
yeah, kind
Yeah,
of,
I think
kind of.
point is well taken.
Yeah, I think it's, the can's been kicked far enough down the road.
Yeah.
It has,
The-
it has.
The buck might stop here, the can might stop here.
What other
I don't know, that's like just throwing things around.
I think
The bolt is.
Yes,
Yeah.
and,
Okay, Rob is- yeah.
Great.
oh, sorry, Rob, I can't see you, but please speak.
Hey, thanks. So, this is something that I've been mentioning to Georgia and Andrew. This is something I've been trying to talk to you about a little bit. This need for capital improvement planning and for essentially taking out some loans, right? I mean, from what I'm hearing is that were a relatively high rate of financial expenditure in getting non-robust solutions because they can't be engineered and sort of the Band-Aid situation that Georgia is mentioning. The other part of it to think about is even if you had saved up enough money to do a robust solution today based upon annual savings, the problem is there that in time you're not matching up the expenditures with the benefits. If you're going to do a CIP, a capital improvement project that has a 20-year life to it, and you pay it with ratepayers' money today, then all the benefits accrue into the future. In some ways, that repayment structure allows you to line up in time the benefits with the costs. So just another plug for loans. So.
All right, well,
I'd love to hear what, Lyndon would say.
well, Lyndon's proposal when he first got on the board was just to slam the ratepayers with this huge increase in everybody's expenditures and create a really big nest egg and go out and attack these
Yeah.
projects. But the board felt that the community it was too hard on the ratepayers, so he was talking about a lot of money, which it is.
And I think he's worked really hard in his time on the board to make sure that we weren't incurring more loans, right? Reducing
Right.
loan. So anyway,
Yeah, no, it was good, and also the whole idea of prioritizing, but what do we have to address first? Where are the most leaks, where is the crew constantly going out to put another patch and another patch? Maybe we should just go to that road, tear it up and just put one whole new section of pipe rather than 6 Band-Aids over a period of 8 months or something, so.
Yeah, but like George said, it may not be where there are the most leaks, but it's where it costs the most to fix.
the
You
most
know, they'll need one or
expensive
two
leaks.
leaks, yeah, like the paved roads sound like they're
Yeah,
sucking up all the.
I think too, some of it is like, this is sort of a new iteration of the operators. And some of it, it's not to say, it's like developing our chops to, kind of really tackle a CIP. I'd say that's not something I've seen our operators be involved in. I wanna recognize that it might not actually be realistic in terms of the amount of time that they actually have, but I think it's something that we should try more in the district. And it's just like, let's, again, yes, let's talk to an engineer and really look at a comprehensive and also contracted project of like Worth Road. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't necessarily think, okay, what does a smaller CIP project look like on Birch Road where, the operators themselves really see like, how much ability do we have? And not just ability, but like, actual time and knowledge or whatever, like a comfort level to basically tackle one of these things. And I think once if it is possible and they got that under their belt, then they would kind of feel like, oh, we can do this. This is less daunting. And maybe, so it's not to say that like everything is like a big, huge capital improvement project. But it's kind of like addressing this in different ways.
all right, why don't you continue?
Okay.
I just have a question about GANSA. Do we have like some kind of mates rate with them for the volume of work that we send their way and or is there a competitor to them that we
We
look
do
at this on
not, I
an
don't know.
annual basis? They like,
No, I think one thing I did think about in terms of, I mean, it's nice to have that relationship and because it is like, oh my gosh, we have, a leak Sunday evening,
right,
send somebody up, right? So it's like we have that kind of rapport that I feel like is so essential and I wouldn't necessarily wanna muck with that. One way in which I've talked to Stu and Bell about like, well, maybe we should do a little test case of even if they, there are more competitors around the paving. And paving is not part of the emergency, right? That's like basically it's done and what does it look like if we contracted with a different paver for essentially, what is the difference in the overall project cost for that? So that's something that, I thought about and I think it's worth like at least having like a little case scenario of, hey, what does it look for, to contract out and how much of a difference does that make in the overall?
Yeah.
That's assuming, yeah, that they've done enough compaction when they're doing a repair so that somebody else coming in. Yeah, I always get worried about having too many finger pointing, oh, well, it sunk because you didn't do the compaction well enough and that wasn't our scope. And so but that's the other thing to keep. in
Yeah.
mind.
Yeah, good point.
But I would agree, I mean, I wanna say, being on Wharf Road that day and suddenly the water went off, usually, you know, the team are excellent about just coming in and letting you know. I know that they were scrambling and, I think Tina took it upon herself to kind of be a communicator with neighbors and said, and I think it was Stu or whoever was on that day, said, we're not going home until your water's back on, so I think it was on at 6. It was impressive.
Nice.
Thanks to your team for
Yeah.
taking the Sunday and making it happen.
Yeah. Okay,
Right.
so moving on to the well project, just to let you guys know, not a ton of movement here, but I did. I talked about this, but I formally requested, this is basically, I have to like formally request from the Department of Water Resources, who is the funder for this, for effectively an extension. The grant effectively runs out at the end of this year in December. And so there's no indication, you know, it's a formality, basically, they're like, we can extend this till September 30th of next year, so that's what I've requested. And essentially, it's like, you know, that's when the construction needs to be done by. So we need to ramp up and really focus on this project, but I think that's important. And then the other thing is that essentially this project is way over budget, primarily due to the coastal development permits. And I mean, as I understand it, they didn't know that those coastal development permits were gonna be required. So that was essentially not part of the grant, and DWR is very receptive to the idea that ultimately we're looking to, you know, they requested that we do it in a stepwise way, where essentially we steal from ourselves to fund our own project by moving money around from the construction phase of things to essentially what is the permitting engineering. And then once they approve that, then we can say, okay, and this is how much we still think construction is gonna cost this much. And so can you give us another $100,000? And it behooves us to do that sooner rather than later, because basically, you know, those are like state funds that are allocated for these grants and all, you know, eventually they will run out.
DWR state agency, state agency.
Yeah, and then this is very weird. Department of, I mean, as Jennifer has described it, they would normally be running a grant like this. And so there were a lot of kind of kinks as they were like,
Okay.
oh, okay, this got thrown in our lap. But this was effectively a drought grant. So that's why the wells project was, you know, competitive and got funded.
That's the whole grant.
Yep. Okay, and then the tank site, I've already talked about this, but basically just to let you know, it's going well. And effectively, we assume that it should still be completed mid-December. But these rains right now are delaying the project, and essentially that will probably move into Thanksgiving. And then we're thinking that we're gonna be back on the site after Thanksgiving. And then just to reiterate this point of basically, we are only on the east tank right now, we're not on the west tank. We have a way to actually access water right now from the west tank if something really bad happened, and we would be able to kind of like generate something to get back that water. But there's actually a period of this project where we cannot touch that water, and that's coming up in like a week. So essentially that will bring a little more security to our, you know, access to water.
So the tank is full.
Tank is full,
Well,
both
but-
tanks are full right now.
Okay.
Okay, this is the radial gate repair, just to let you know, last time I spoke to you, I said there was like a bunch of Gannett Fleming projects that needed to get moving, and basically I connected with the engineer at Cadet Fleming and essentially started to at least administratively move these projects forward. Essentially, I got a proposal from them, in the amount of 28,280 for this assessment. Basically that allowed me, there's enough information there that I am turning around and using that to submit for the permit from the national park, to essentially tell them what this assessment will involve. And then, unfortunately, I mean, this is kind of maybe a moot point because there was some question as to whether the technician that would be important for assessment of the cement and stuff like that would even be available. But right now I was really trying to, impress on them that like, hey, we want to get this done before the rains. And now it's like, the rains came.
Yeah.
So I need to communicate with him as to like, is this a situation where we just put this off to the spring, or are you still wanting to do this right now? Like, what is that? But basically, I think regardless, assuming that the permit lasts for a period of time, I mean, I have to specify when we would be doing the work. But assuming it's not like, oh, you can only get a permit for, you know, a 2-month period or something like that, I would say just like move forward with all this, get everything in a row and all ducks in a row so that when they have the go signal, everything's ready to go.
I think last spring, they said that they have to do this work in like October, November before the rains.
Yeah.
We might have to wait till next fall.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and, I mean, that's basically, the flows are still really low, because that's the primary concern. So even with these rains, it's not so much like, oh, it's raining, it's basically, can we, you know, divert
Right.
the creek while we do this assessment? And, you know, the creek flows are very likely to still be low even with the rains that we got, so that's why I just need to, you know, essentially communicate with them around the feasibility of still getting it done. But that is kind of, we'll have to see,
And do you have to go to the county as well,
to have this assessment?
for permitting?
No,
No, not for the assessment.
Federal, because it's federal land, so.
yeah,
Not so much for the assessment, but as for the work. I mean.
Oh, the work? Yeah, I mean, I have no idea, honestly, we'll see, and hopefully they'll be informing us on some of that too. But basically, I'm not really, I mean, obviously doing the assessment is like, take picture, you know, it's like, I mean, and that's one of my questions is basically you talked about this technician and using, a, like, some sort of sonic device to be able to determine like the kind of structural integrity of the cement. In their most recent proposal, I didn't see, even though he verbally communicated with me that was gonna happen, I didn't see that in the proposal, so I need to figure out, but if it doesn't include that, it's like very non-invasive, except for having to minimize the amount of water that's there, you know, so basically moving the gate up and down and like, you know, looking at, you know, visually inspecting the integrity of all of these different components. So it's like very like non-disruptive. But obviously, depending on what that they come up with as solutions, I have no idea how hard it will be to get effectively permit approval to do that work and what agencies I'll need to reach out to. Although my understanding in talking to Jennifer was that as a national park, it's like they're the deciders.
that's what I recall too.
Anyway,
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know how long that permit is for, as well, for the construction.
well, that's another thing that I was thinking too, because I don't wanna,
Typically be 3 years.
this is another thing that I was thinking about in terms of capital improvements, like I know that we have money set aside for this assessment. But then I was like, we don't really have money set aside for the actual work. So does it even make sense, like to your point, to have an assessment if it ultimately takes us, you know, especially if we're doing this thing of, oh, we found out that it's gonna cost us $500,000, we're gonna, you know, stock away this much money over the next 5 years, is that even appropriate? Because basically the, you know, the further away you get from the assessment, the less kind of relevant it becomes, especially in terms of like the predicting costs and all that, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think that's something that us as a finance committee should talk about too, is like, is there a value in even pushing this off until we come up with like, you know, essentially our, what is our prioritization list? And, you know, once things get prioritized, or should we secure funding before we even do this kind of assessment? I don't know, but it's a little, it did make me anxious about like, okay, we're spending $30,000, but not with a clear path in mind of how we actually get things fixed, which is ultimately what we care about, right?
Well, that's what the assessment is.
Yeah.
The assessment is the MRI, and you don't know if you need to have knee surgery or if you can just walk around in crutches for 6 weeks. Like,
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's
So-
important to know, especially if
Yeah.
we have another low rain year, that having an operational gate is essential, right? I mean, that keeps us in business, keeps,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah,
keeps the
sorry, I
lights on.
glossed over that, but basically, one thing that was interesting is that when we were in that drought condition and we went on Wood Rat 1, the same thing that happened the day that we went on Wood Rat 1, we also went to the upper dam. Which was like, I was like, wait, what? Like, that didn't all make all that sense to me, but basically, we were able to maintain supply up there. Better than we were down below, which is counterintuitive, but it's essentially because of the state of the radio gate.
Yeah.
So much water is leaking through that it's a very ineffective impoundment. And so essentially, the upper dam is working better than the lower dam at present, and so. You know, with that in mind, it's like, well, you know, those weren't major drought conditions, but the upper dam was effectively enabled us to, you know, we're still on it, and, yeah, anyway.
And so just to clarify again, you're saying it's not clear if the technician for scanning the concrete is included in this 28,000.
Yeah, I don't know, I mean, I expressly
seems
have
like that's
a
something-
question
yeah.
that I'm waiting for a response on. Because, like I said, in verbal communication, it was like, well, I don't know if we can get it done as soon as you want, because, you know, there's essentially this equipment and plus this technician, and they're a little backlogged. And so I'm not sure, and then when I saw the proposal, I saw that they weren't there, so I don't know if that was because they were like, it was, you know, oh no, that's, you know, embedded here in this, you know, visual inspection is gonna involve that, like, I have no idea, but I'll basically find out.
It just seems like if we're gonna take the time to do an assessment, yes, we should make sure that it's. a
Yeah, I don't know,
thorough
again, and that's another question is like, oh, did he remove that
Yeah.
because he thought there was such urgency and that person wasn't available? And you know, would it make more sense to just like, okay, let's wait till next, you know, low flow and actually do this properly? I don't know. And I totally recognize that, Andrew, around like, okay, that's what this assessment is about. But I do think that there should be some sort of realistic sense of when we get a proposal, we're ready to hit go. Like if, you know, depending on what that proposal says, as far as like within the next 2 years, we should be coming up with a funding scheme for how we're gonna actually address this. I feel like, you know, there's kind of, it's easy essentially to, you know, spend $30,000, which obviously isn't like $1 million, and get this information and then not be able to act on it as quickly as we should.
Well, maybe we'll luck out in the assessment and be as
Yeah.
dire as we are anticipating.
I just want to say that in the time that I've been on this board, we have not spent money frivolously. Like when we've done an assessment because we were really concerned about something because it was leaking a lot. You know,
Oh, yeah.
we're frugal, but I think that at some point the rubber needs to hit the road that we may need to raise rates. Like there's a lot of stuff that needs to be fixed. And yes, we want to keep things as affordable as possible for the customers, but if that means that our infrastructure gets less and less and less effective, that's ultimately to the detriment of the people in this town.
Yes.
You know, so I think that the balance, we need to take a sharp look at that. And I mean, I know we do it on an ongoing basis, but I'm just saying it out loud again, because none of these projects that we've talked about tonight are frivolous projects.
Yeah.
They're all critical projects and they're expensive.
Yeah.
And if that means that as a town, in order to support the fact that we've got water coming out of the taps, we need to pay more, then that's the reality.
Yeah.
That people need to,
And I think as the finance
Understand.
committee, we have been taking that definitely into consideration
I'm
and,
sure,
we've
yeah.
been making incremental increases.
Yeah.
You may not see it directly,
I'm supporting.
but yeah. But it is going through the county and people would see it on their,
Yeah.
tax
Well,
bills.
you know, one thing that the district did some years ago, and it took a while to pay it off, but we actually took out a bond, sold bonds.
Yeah.
And that way you get that large lump sum of money that you need to do your projects, and then you just add that bond to your tax bill, and we all look at our property tax bills, and we're already paying 40 bonds, so this would be number 41. But that would be a way for the district to get the money that we need and to make the pain less for the property owners by spreading out the repayment over a long period of time.
Yes.
So I would.
And I think too, just to reiterate Rob's point, it's not even just about minimizing the pain for current ratepayers, it's also sort of an ethical approach to, you don't necessarily, you know, let's say we raised rates over the next 5 years to really build up our reserves so we could tackle 3 of these projects. And ultimately, those folks paid a lot of money over a short period of time, but they didn't even reap the benefits of it necessarily, right? Where ultimately that project lasts for the next 20 years, and those people that are the beneficiaries should effectively pay for.
Yeah.
And that's what obviously a bond does, because you're paying for that project that was done 5 years ago over the next 20 years.
Yes.
Yeah, anyway.
So which committee would be responsible for the CIP?
Well, this is something that I was talking about before. I really think that, you know, when, I mean, that was right when I joined, and I didn't really know what I was doing, not that I necessarily know what I'm doing now, but I really didn't know what I was doing then. And that is a very, I'd say the financial and all of this side of things is the most complicated thing that I deal with and am dealing with. And what I found, I don't know what your sort of sense of it was, but it was like the CIP thing was sort of like a little snippet of a kind of meeting that we had in this broad discussion around the overall budget. And it was sort of like, oh yeah, and then there's also the CIP, and this is what it looks like.
Right.
So, I mentioned this before, unfortunately, it's like, I have so much to learn around the budgetary process and all of that I don't even know if I necessarily want to implement like major changes this year when I'm just kind of learning it. I think there's a lot of value in kind of learning how things are done or were done, so that I can be like, oh, I get it, and then modify things. And I haven't gone through a full budget cycle yet. But what I would recommend is that we, you know, and this is a lot to ask of the people on the finance committee, but I really think that you would see it as 2 seasons. One is the CIP, which happens ideally around this time of year, and then the next is the budget cycle. So that when we talk, you know, when we start to talk about the CIP projects within the budgetary cycle, we've already had meetings that were solely devoted to CIP and exactly these types of things. How do we prioritize this? How do we know that, let's say we get a proposal back from the radial gate, or not a proposal, but assessment, and they say it's gonna cost you, $1 million to do this. How do we, and then we go and we get a proposal from, whatever to look at what would it be to kind of fortify the wharf main and move it inland or whatever it is, and that's gonna cost, $500,000. How do we weigh those 2 things, right? And so, basically, yeah, that's what I would suggest is, again, maybe not this year, because it's already, but maybe, some of that kind of like baby steps towards what does this look like, and essentially a couple meetings of CIP leading into our budget cycle. Because the two are so inextricably connected, that it's really, but also it's so dense, right? It's just like, again, I think that it's not doing our CIP justice to just basically have it embedded within a budgetary, conversation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think we have highlighted, to your point, the items, or we've talked about how do we identify which are the critical path items that are gonna be coming up in the next 5 years, right? And then 10 years, and that I think is not only, it's with the finance committee, but also it should be with the operations committee maybe, and also your team in the field, just to hear from them of these 10 items, what seems to be the most critical path. And so that's why I was asking who's the committee that's gonna create the CIP next year. Creating this committee.
Yeah,
I think it has to be the finance.
the finance committee, I would say, is
Yeah.
basically a seasonal thing.
Yeah.
The fall is CIP, and the spring is finance.
Yeah, well, we could always take a preliminary look at what it takes to float a bond. I mean, the finance committee would have to come up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point too, is like, there's all this. Also, what feels a little bit neglected is, how do we pay for things? Cause I don't think that the current thing of, slowly building funds, to me, feels a little bit
No.
not appropriate.
Well, remember we did that sampling in spring with Jennifer, and we saw that like if we wanted to address all of our immediate capital improvement projects, it was like a $3,500 one-time rate increase for this year to cover that. And it was like, we were never gonna implement it, but we were kind of looking at the spectrum of like, okay, what is the 10% increase? What is the, what are 5 capital improvement projects percent, or what is like tier 1 and tier 2? And it was like, yeah, we need a bond.
Yeah. Yeah. I think,
I just, something occurred to me, if you're thinking about doing a bond, and we're also working on perhaps expanding to have electric, it may be worth it to do the full picture for people to say, okay, if we do this bond and your electric bills come down, then that may balance out with what we're gonna have to increase with your water, because there are a lot of infrastructure things that have to be dealt with. So it could all be of a package that might make it be more understandable for people, so they don't just all of a sudden go,
Yeah, it's all connected.
yeah,
right?
and because people's electric bills are going up incredibly.
Yeah.
So,
Yes, they are.
Speaking of which.
So,
That
maybe
was
not.
to the solar inverters, they should be out at the end of this week to fix the, inverter number 2. The cost, for that is estimated around $6,000.
Yeah.
So that will be a happy day. Another, just wanted to point out, I don't know, Belle, are you still there? Sorry.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Belle.
Hi.
So I just wanted to point out, and Belle was the real force behind this, so she's here to answer any of your questions. But basically we had what is called a lead inventory, and that's what we're calling it. But basically this is the EPA's new lead and copper rule revisions that essentially it was all around, upping our game to ensure that public water providers are ensuring that there's no lead in our systems. So this is a visual inventory that needs to take place, where essentially, the operators went around and looked at what is the service line. So, I mean, I'm sure you guys know this, but for the public, if this is your water main, the service line is the tangential line that leads from the water main to your home. And then that's kind of divided into 2 portions based on, the meter. So everything before the meter is essentially BCPUD's service line, and everything after the meter is, the customer's service line. So this was like the leak relief that we just talked about, would have been on their service line, but not in the house, right? Which is obviously what makes makes it hard to detect because it's out there in the yard or whatever. So, essentially what they do is they go and do a visual inspection and ensure that effectively that line is either made of copper or plastic. That's basically the only things that are not gonna get flagged in this, inventory system. And that's essentially because, like other lines, let's say it's like, you know, steel, or, that it's like, it could potentially be galvanized. And, while galvanized offers a protection to that metal, it also potentially acts as a sink for lead. And so that's not, you know, a real concern for us in our system because we don't have lead, we measure lead regularly, and we don't have high lead levels. But there's no, you know, like essentially out of an abundance of caution, it's like, well, those kinds of metal, you never know, earlier on in this system, there could have been lead piping, and I mean, again, this is obviously like Flint, Michigan and all of that is like informing this whole thing, right? Where it's essentially, you know, this like lead is no joke, obviously, and so, it's like a really stringent kind of, you need to replace things that are not fully known. And so that's basically, if it's copper or plastic, it's fine, everything else is problematic and has to eventually go. So what we had was 27 service lines that essentially are problematic. We had 6 in total, essentially, if you like look at the ones on our end that we need to replace, there's 6 of them. And then on the customer side of things, there's 21 that need to be replaced. Some of these are actually, you know, a few of these are like both on our side and their side. So this is not, even though it's 27 service lines, it's not impacting 27 customers, if that makes sense. And then we're looking for further guidance from the EPA. Again, this is just like the first push to like, hey, you need to inventory all of this. You need to flag these things. You need to notify those customers. And we're just at that kind of stage. And then we're still looking for guidance like, okay, now that we know, when do we have to replace these by? Is there gonna be any public funds? Are we gonna be responsible to replace obviously our own on our side, but also the ones on the customer side? There's like private property issues around that. Like there's all kinds of complexity there that's not clear. And essentially Bell is navigating all of that complexity. So I don't know, Belle, if you want to add more.
No, I mean, you pretty much laid it all out there. I did notice they gave people 10 years to replace, you know, the service lines. Obviously, I think we have so few, and for, you know, the betterment of everybody, it'd be good to just get them replaced as soon as possible, especially our lines, and then try to find more information about funding for the customers and whether or not, you know, that's kind of one of the pieces is this our responsibility to replace the customers because it's just part of our system, or is that the customer's responsibility, and do we point them to possible funding, and is that something that the district gets and then provides the service for? There's still some unknowns in that regard.
Isn't this kind of analogous to when we had people replace their sewer lines and we dealt with the flow out to our main, but when it was
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of the same in terms of who's responsible for what. I have a feeling because this is sort of it's a kind of rolling out process. They keep kind of ramping up the requirements of the districts to for what they need to get done, because essentially they're concerned that there's sort of some financial social justice issues where if the customer has to pay for it and they don't, then, and they have a tenant, and, you know, then it's people who can't afford to change out their service lines are now ending up with, you know, possible lead in their water. So I have a feeling, just an inkling, that they're going to probably make districts do it in the future, but we're not there yet, as far as I know.
Right.
And one of the things that we have, Bill and I have talked about is also like for, 10 years is a long time, navigating this complexity is maybe also adds delays. And like I said, or like Bill said, it's, not that big of a deal for us to change out those 6 ones and prioritize that. And understand that it's our responsibility, but also to what extent can we just like take samples at the top
Mhm.
for these people and give them some peace of mind, because you send this letter and like half of the letter is basically the scariness of the impacts of lead, which feels
Mhm.
crappy when you're also saying like, hey, we don't know if maybe it's on you, like, whatever, see if we can help you. And just like in the interim, essentially, it's not that expensive for us to do lead testing at all of, these, however many houses. And basically, at least in that single sample is just essentially, hey, we're navigating all of this, but just to assure you, this is what your, lead levels look like in your house.
Yeah.
Again, I don't know if that's like, maybe not a good idea, you know what I mean, like we need to think about it a little bit more, because it's not like our regulated mandate or anything, but, it's something that we've talked about.
All right, want to continue?
Could we point these customers to a water filter, that'd be a very short term, near term solution would be to, out of abundance of caution, just check some Brita filters filter out lead.
Yes,
So,
and the whole end of this letter is basically resources, things you can do to minimize your exposure to lead, blah, 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 so.
Yeah.
There's definitely, that's actually supplied, I didn't put that here, this is like sort of the beginning of the letter. Okay, then quickly, we are ready for the Gannett Fleming engineering firm to provide assessment and construction drawings. This had been a long time, so in my conversation with the engineer there, I essentially said, hey, let's revamp the proposal, make sure the agreement is still, and so we basically had to rehash some of that, and this is essentially what the new proposal is, which wasn't far away from the one that you guys approved already. And he assured me that this one can be done during the winter. And so, yeah, I think it's just kind of, you pick great tides or whatever, but they should be able to do it. So that hopefully is moving forward. The other one that was Gannett Fleming was the seawall. And essentially this all kind of like seemed like it was kind of boiling to a head during the summer, where they reached out to us and said, hey, can you have a couple of operators come down and dig out these piles so that we can assess them? And then essentially it was like crickets for several months. And then when I re-engaged with him on these other projects, I said, by the way, what's going on with this project? And it just happened that he was like that afternoon getting on a call with the county to essentially kind of revamp this. There's 2 new engineers at the county that are on this project. And then with I'm gonna talk about this in a second, but basically the beach closure, there was a walk, that engineer was on the walk with me and Stu, and we looked at it, and essentially the plan for us to hand dig those out, take some photos, is back on task, and we'll essentially do that, not this week, but hopefully next week.
Cool.
Which brings me to the last thing, which is essentially this beach closure. There was a town hall meeting before this meeting at 5. I'm not sure if any of you guys attended that. It was not a ton of new information. We're still kind of in the same status quo where effectively the beach is closed from the Canyon Road all the way to Rosewood Road. We had this walk that I just alluded to. Sorry, I just got some stuff in the way here.
Who got to go on the walk? I mean, I see the names, but I'm just curious
How did this
who was
happen?
invited.
Yeah, essentially what happened is, pretty early on in this, the whole county efforts, I had been, representatives in the community had reached out to me, people have been reaching out to the county directly. I put a list together of people that, that were kind of like technocrats in our village and also people that are, have historical knowledge about this problem. And I basically sent it to the county to be like, hey, here are some folks that I think would be helpful, and you should, you know, reach out to them. Essentially the, Rodoni, I think, was kind of the spearhead behind this. He really wanted people that were making the decisions in the county to actually get out here and see in person what was going on, the impacts, both the economic impacts. So I didn't list that person, and I'm forgetting her last name, but Raisa, who is some like economic development person at the county, she was on the walk as well. So it's just kind of like, you know, recognizing the impact that it's had, both on the economics, but also obviously on like the kind of overall well-being, and what is it, you know, are people adhering to this, and you know, what is the actual state of the bluff look like? Because there was a lot of confusion about how much flow there was to begin with, and that dissemination of the 45,000 gallons a day or whatever. Anyway, so I really appreciated that they basically, this was the county's thing, and essentially I passed this on to a few folks in town that I thought would be really helpful to have on that walk. Essentially, you know, it was, I would say, a real back and forth in terms of the conversation. But with, you know, Rob Gailey taking a central role in terms of, you know, kind of like almost treating it as like a mini lecture. Here's the lagoon, here's, you know, 200 seals that are in the lagoon. So when you take your water sample right here at the, you know, lagoon mouth, a lot of what you're measuring is probably, you know, mammalian activity from that. So let's not conflate that with what's going on over here. So, you know, and I think that the county at this point already appreciated a lot of what we have, what we were saying in the, you know, like in that kind of like technical aspect of what we're trying to convey to them. I think that there is, I felt like full agreement that they want to reopen the beach. I think that they are dealing with sort of the kind of legal barriers to feeling like they can do that in a sensible way, and that a little bit like, well, their hands are tied. That's kind of what they convey. I would I'm just gonna read through this real quick if you guys don't mind.
Where are their hands tied? How are their hands tied?
Well, they would, I mean, I think I would urge you to listen to the recording of today's meeting, because they started, you know, this is primarily Lisa Santora, who is the, you know, health and human services person who ultimately needs to make the decision around whether, you know, effluent on the bluff is posing a danger to, like, you know, humans and domestic animals or whatever. Like, it's kind of in her, her responsibility to make that decision. And essentially, I think that she sees, language that says essentially, if you've seen sewage here, like sewage, and you, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name, it's like, there's some appended adjective to that sewage, but basically they have video of at some point, there was sewage here, we tested it, it had, you know, harmful bacteria in it, and we haven't, fully mitigated that issue. So we have to do that before we open the beach. That's kind of, and I think that they're, you know, where this is really getting to is basically them, Lisa primarily too, with council interpretation of that regulatory language, and how do we look at that and develop either a path forward to reopening, or does that even exist, right? Like, you know, at some level, it's sort of these stringent interpretations, I would say, that are kind of like, you know, and it's, I think we need to be totally candid. Right now, I'd say the balance between, you know, what is the benefit to them reopening the beach? What is the risk to them reopening the beach? There's not a lot, you know, if you look at in terms of, I would say what's not being really forcefully conveyed enough at this point, and maybe it's like, okay, well, I'm a business downtown and I'm gonna sue you for having the beach closed. Now, like, oh wait, council, now we have this other counterbalancing thing that we need to consider. But right now, it's just like, we could get sued if somebody gets sick and they.
But
and
has
we
anybody
reopen-
gotten sick?
What's that?
Has anybody gotten sick?
No, I
We
don't
haven't
think
heard
so.
of it.
And I think, but that's the point is that what, you know, it's like the potential that somebody does get sick and they come back to you and say, why did you reopen the beach? My child just went over there and it was, you know, I mean, this is really, and I mean, I express this not because I necessarily am totally aligned with this viewpoint, but I am sensitive that this is what Lisa's actually, you know, Santora is faced with, right? And it's a very, you know, I acknowledge that I think they're doing what they can to reopen, you know what I mean? Like they're trying to think of ways to reopen, but they're also, you know, feeling like the path forward is not obvious.
Did they ever, and I know we don't need to go into this too far, but did they ever like retest? Because they closed the beach after they did these tests, but the tests were all wrong. So I think that's like the grounds for these businesses who are like, you closed the beach, but it was incorrect that you closed it. So we suffered significantly. Like, have there been another round of tests that do confirm that what they first suspected is actually scientifically in existence?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that that's all complicated, and basically I've been in, well, let me just go through this and then I'll get to this issue, okay? So I think some important points were made on that walk. So animals live and humans camp along the bluff, and so could be sources of fecal contamination. So I think that Lisa would counter to that point, basically, however, whether the effluent is contaminated with human versus animal feces makes no difference as far as the potential adverse impacts on health. And as far as triggering a beach closure. So one point that she kept coming back to is basically, you know, this incident in Fairfax with the creek where essentially a child got really sick and hospitalized. And then it turned out this was like, you know, a small creek that was essentially contaminated from deer feces. Okay, so it's like, it still presents that health hazard. But I think that's important because now when we look at like how this was all talked about when this came out the gate was like, there's a massive septic system issue on the mesa. And that was probably like premature to start going, you know, bringing in all of that issue without understanding what the source of contaminant was in the specific sample that they were looking at, right? And I don't think that they were necessarily saying, oh, this is, you know, this is a septic issue. But it was the language around it, that's kind of where the media and ultimately people understood it as like, oh, there's massive sewage just flowing in to the ocean. Like that was kind of what I was hearing right at the beginning.
You know, I have a problem with that distinction, though. It doesn't matter whether it's animal or human, because that animal contribution to the groundwater that ends up seeping out of the cliff has been going on for hundreds of years and all up and down the coast. So either they're gonna close all the beaches because that same phenomenon is going on everywhere, or you go, wait a minute, that's part of the natural phenomenon that goes on and you can't just do that.
I agree, Jack, and but I think that that's, you know, where she is basically, well, I'm the health officer and I'm responsible for making sure people are healthy. And basically, if I go and measure, you know, a sample from this, you know, like creek flow or whatever, and I find that it has, you know, pathogenic, like a E. coli in it, that's gonna get a kid sick, then I need to close this beach.
Fair.
So anyway, so I mean, it's like, I recognize where she's coming from.
Yeah.
I also recognize that seems incredibly impractical,
Yes,
right? It's
Yeah.
like, well, you could have, you know, anyway.
yeah.
So,
Keep going.
yeah,
Let's let her finish.
okay. The visual vestige of a seep salt deposits does not necessarily indicate that there was fecal contaminated groundwater flowing at this spot. I think there was
Saying that.
what's that?
I'm glad they're finally saying that.
Yes, and I mean, this is also us conveying this to them, but I think they recognized, yes, we agree with you. So it was like, you know, they weren't pushing back on any of these points. It is normal for groundwater to seep at the cliff at regular junctions where geology propels that water to daylight at the cliff. I think it's really important. I think there was, again, around this 45,000 gallons of, it's like, oh my God, there's all this like effluent flowing, and it's like, well, that's groundwater.
Yeah.
And it just rained, right? So I think, there needs to be some, testing protocols matter, and they should be designed and reviewed with intention. What questions are you trying to answer? You know, you need to go into it with, are we just trying to detect E. coli? In which case, we don't really care if it's coming from a human source or not. I mean, at some level, I don't really quite understand what the obsession is with, if again, if you take them at their word and all they care about is, you know, potential health hazard, then why not just be like, oh, that's what it is? Except that if, from their standpoint, they were probably saying, okay, but we want to mitigate that so we can reopen the beach. So then we have to understand where this source is. Is this human? Is this, you know, whatever. So you get into that whole thing.
Rob Keeley has his hand up, and Jenny had something.
Yeah. And county reps expressed their desire to reopen the beach, but also conveyed that a path to reopening remains unclear. This is their major point. If you listen to their talk today, it's basically that's it in a nutshell. And if you go to any of their meetings, that's basically what they'll tell you. But obviously this is the county's jurisdiction around reopening the beach, clearly, and it will be their decision. But just to reiterate, the beach remains closed. And yeah, so I don't know if we wanna, I have one other slide, if you guys don't mind, I'll just go through that quickly and then maybe other people can chime in. So I have conveyed my opinion to the county on this matter. I meet weekly with Chris Chu on Wednesdays, and so I again reiterated these points. I've already talked to her about them, and I don't mean to say, sorry, I don't mean to imply that they don't agree with these points when I say these are my opinions. But basically, I think that the beach should be reopened with an advisory to stay away from the cliff at this point. I think that county should run a safe to recreate. Basically, you know, that test that they take at the mouth of the lagoon, that testing period, because that fades, their normal testing program fades in the winter months, because basically, you know, they figure people are primarily going in the water during the summer. I think there's a question as to whether that's even accurate when you look at like all of the surfers that are out here. But beyond that, I think that it would make sense to essentially do a similar effective expansion of that testing program where you're really focused on this other issue, which is go close to, you know, where you think this source of contaminant is coming from and measure water quality, you know, ocean water quality near that point source. If that looks okay, then essentially when you do your tests of whatever's going on the bluff, at least you can assure people, hey, this isn't impacting ocean quality. And just again, this is an important counterpoint to make because of that 45,000 gallon thing that got out and is in people's minds of like raw sewage just flowing into the ocean. So again, I think, you know, whether they do that, I'm not sure. I mean, but it's something that they, at least some people at the county are supportive of. And I think also county needs to be thoughtful and careful in conducting and interpreting further tests along the bluff by testing samples collected from flows or dried seeps. So it is not clear to me what data they are seeking to collect that will inform their decision to either maintain the closure or to lift it. And I think that's really important. They basically took spot tests again today, is my understanding. I don't know how they're collecting those, and I don't know what they're gonna do with that data once they collect it. So, I mean, I wish I could have influenced that process more to be like, is it prudent for you to take these and where are you taking them? Because I would really urge them, if they really are, to your point, Jack, because you know, and I made these points in our walk, it's like, what drove you to this was a specific thing. Keep your focus on that thing. If you start a fishing expedition where you start testing wherever, you can go all the way out to RCA. And to your point, there's a large deer colony there. And basically, you know what, we're closing RCA because we measure flows, you know, contaminated flows there. Like, where does, you know, it just feels a little arbitrary.
Yes.
Anyways, so, but they took spots test today. I will remain informed about how those go. I conveyed at the meeting, I'm really concerned about even the idea of a spot test because, it's important to recognize that these more fleshed out protocols for testing in bodies of waters like the one that they do in the ocean, it's clear that you have sort of different thresholds that inform action. But they are generally around, you know, a certain amount of a constituent in a given amount of volume, right? And so that's your concentration of this contaminant. And then, you know, if it's above that threshold, that's problematic and you have to issue an advisory or whatever, right? But here where you're taking a spot test, you're taking essentially solids, having to dissolve them in some amount of liquid, and then what? Inferring from that, oh, there's contaminants here. It's hard to know what to even do with that, and in talking to the regional board, there's not a lot of well spelled out and thoughtful protocol for how you even do that. And so I'm a little concerned that the county is basically gonna collect this data, and what will they do with that data?
Is EHS doing the testing?
For today, I imagine that was primarily who was involved in the testing. I think those are basically the technicians that undertake that. I don't know, I think that though, you know, previously the regional board was involved in some other of the PCR testing, and I'm not sure to what extent they were involved in this. Maybe Rob knows more about it because I got onto that meeting a little bit late today. And they'd already started to talk about some of the you know, the spot testing. What was the other thing I was gonna say? Just one other point is that there was some testing, you know, to your point, Andrew, and I said I'd come back to this. They did go and they collect samples from, you know, with the regional board, with the intent that the regional board would conduct PCR testing to see if this was, you know, had human genetic signatures. And basically those samples, as I understand, I'm a little confused about this, but basically those samples came back negative. I don't know if they came back negative for E. coli, but my understanding is that they did. So that essentially there was no problem with the flows that they measured. So those, I think the county's position on that, and that's why they started to do these spot tests, is that those flows were too flowing. Those were not the problematic, those were basically, you know, groundwater springs. So, you know, that wasn't the problem.
Okay.
Anyway, so,
But the Regional Water Quality Control Board did the test.
they did the tests and they collected the samples, I think in conjunction, you know, they were being informed by the county, so I'm not exactly sure why they went to the, you know, why the county after the fact was like, no, that's not where we want to do that. I'm like, were you guys there? Like, it's a little confusing and, anyway, so, and again, I mean, I do wanna, just like, I feel like a little bit, like I need to, acknowledge that it's a difficult predicament that the county is in. And I also appreciate that they really want to reopen the beach. And I genuinely think that's, you know, true. I think, you know, and don't want this to come off as like, throwing the county under the bus or anything, but I just wanted to convey to, I mean, I know that it's, something that people care about. At the same time, you'll see my last point here is that I don't really know, what I'm doing in this, you know, at some level, I'm involved with this because of, you know, the septic to sewer program and some of this obviously in as much as it comes back to systemic issues around septic systems, that's more clearly in my wheelhouse. As far as impacting the beach closure. My personal opinion is that this really comes down to county, like, health and human services and county council interpretation of language and them figuring out a way to reopen the beach. I'm not in that room. I don't necessarily even want to be in that room. But I don't think there's a ton of value in me spending a lot of time at this point. I mean, I'll stay informed, but I don't, and also I would say that for like the community members that have really volunteered their time and have, conveyed information to the county, I'd say, it's not necessarily a good use of their time either. Like, this is basically feels like it's very clearly in the laps of the county and they need to essentially make decisions. And as much as we can inform them in that decision making, like, I feel like I've conveyed some of my.
Yeah,
needs here.
I think that you represent the eyes and ears, at least for this board,
Mhm.
on what's going on, and we appreciate just hearing from you.
Yeah.
Even if you have no decision-making authority,
Mhm.
it helps us a lot to stay on it.
Yeah.
And, cause it's a community problem, and, I appreciate that you're doing this, even though you're right, nobody's asking you to help make the
Right.
decision, but you're helping us stay informed. And in turn, the community, so,
Okay.
I don't want you.
And you're expressing an opinion that I fully support, and
Yes.
you're pushing the county to act faster, to look at it in a different way than they otherwise might, so I think that's been really important. Yeah. So I
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Yeah, you're making a good contribution to it. Yeah.
Jenny
and Rob have been wanting to talk for a while.
just want to support what you said too, because as we heard at the Bolinas Lagoon Advisory Council meeting, when Dr. Centor was there, she did indicate that the testing of the water showed no contamination. It was just that the beach effluent areas. So there was an indication that people could go use the beach in the water. If you go in the water, you're okay, but just don't go up on the beach. So I really appreciate what you say here about it should be reopened with advisory and stay away from the cliff, because that seems to be where it is. Also, I was disappointed that she didn't follow through. There were a lot of comments at that meeting where people were saying, can you please let us know more in advance about the county meetings? And she said, yes, they would, but there actually was no big splash about it. And I know some of us are on lists of the county to please be notified with those for the notice. And I didn't get my notice, and I have gotten them in the past. So I'm glad you were there, and thank you for that. And I appreciate your comments on it, because they aren't gonna be testing the water anymore. October 31st was their last day, but she did say every 2 weeks they're gonna be testing the spots on the beach. It's what I wrote down anyway. She said they test every 2 weeks, those spots on Tuesdays.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they're gonna test every 2 weeks. They definitely haven't been doing that yet, and I don't know that they have a plan to do that, so I would say that might be not correct, but I don't know.
Okay, well, I appreciate you with that, because it was disappointment that they didn't put the news out there like they said they were going to for the community. They were gonna advertise it on next door, they were gonna put it in hearsay, whatever. So thank you.
All right.
I think they'll put a recording up. They did for the last couple that they did, so hopefully they'll put a recording up.
All right, George, I know it's been quite a long meeting, so I want to keep going with the agenda unless.
Rob, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm not sure if he's still there, but.
There, Rob?
Yeah, I'm here. So,
Okay.
so a couple of points. The first is that the county is heavily dependent upon the state on several dimensions. One is the legal interpretation of what is sewage discharge. This whole issue about is something that comes from an animal sewage. I think they're getting wrapped up in something like a confined animal feeding operation or a dairy where you have concentrations of feces, and sometimes you can get runoff and discharge, and they can't interpret it, and they're having problems getting the state. They said on the second recording, they're getting problems having the state pick up the phone to be responsive to them. They're also dependent upon the state for technical guidance and some of the sampling, and this wraps into the third dimension of their dependency, which is financial. I think that they don't have the wherewithal financially, or the willingness at least, to send their own people out to take more samples after the first time. So second point is the goalposts are fuzzy. You know, if you listen to what they say carefully, it has morphed and it has changed. First, they were concerned about the beach, then they were concerned about being near the cliff, then last time they were concerned about the tide pools. They've also talked about the densification of septic systems on the mesa in passing in our meeting on Friday, which is a red flag to me. That's a very different topic. And tonight on the call, they talked about the fragile ecosystem, which is the first time this has been mentioned. I'm not exactly sure whether they're talking about Agate Beach or the reef, you know, the area of special biological significance, or what the situation is there. But I think that we're probably in a long game here in terms of engagement, and there's going to be a need probably to elevate it to the supervisors of some of the people at the state, once the state is really involved and engaged, in order to try to get some people who have experience with this and making calls where things are a little complicated.
Well, thank you for, contributing that. I think we'll just have to stay on it, but hopefully we can convince them to open up the beach, or at least stop the promotion of the idea that, we've got sewage flowing onto our beach. So, all right, let's keep going.
And so Rob also volunteered his time, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
and on his
Thank you, Rob.
birthday, no less.
Oh.
Today?
No, this was on the walk on the November 15th.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, I think, and he really did, an amazing job in, essentially providing like a lecture around the geology and.
Yeah, they need to understand that.
And who's Bonnie? So I don't know.
Bonnie Jones.
Oh, yeah.
She is a, engineer who works on wastewater systems, including worked on the septic program in Stinson, and also for the city county of San Francisco. She also worked on the Cuesta study in the 1980s, so anyways, she was really, a perfect, knowledgeable person to be involved in this.
Yeah.
I will, think so. Okay,
Continue.
that is the end of the manager's reports, right?
All right, so public hearings, none. Item 3, we already addressed. Item 4, Stinson Waters SB1 grant from Ocean Protection Council.
Yep, so this actually kind of dovetails with what we were just talking about, but basically, and I included a, the grant proposal, not intending that you guys read all of this, especially as I just put it up there. But basically, when you get a chance, take a look at it, because I will be bringing this on probably the next couple of meetings for you guys, because essentially what happened is, that Stinson Beach was awarded a grant to look at their on-site wastewater treatment systems, or septic systems, and look at a feasibility study to get them off of their septic systems. One of the things that they propose is to look at a regional approach, essentially, to what extent could they work with us? And so, I appreciated that Mark Matheson, who's the, grants writer over there, shared this with me. And at the point that he requested that I attend a meeting where essentially, this grant was at least, supported. It hasn't, the grant agreement has not been executed yet. But at that meeting, I was aware that we have similar kind of issues in Bolinas, and we also have a technical, order from the state regional board that we need to address aspects of our treatment plan. And so a lot of what was talked about in their proposal was essentially things that we will have to do over the next 5 years, and that are expensive and unfunded. And so I was like, well, this is interesting, maybe I should submit a proposal to fund our, because the funding rate was very high, like most things that were in this, pool of proposals actually got funded. So when I did that though, I essentially got feedback that our grant was too overlapping with Stinson's grant. And so that made me wonder, well, this is weird, right? We should be actually in this grant, and if you look at it closely, you'll see that we are talked about a lot in this grant.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate that Mark, had involvement early on, and effectively, as soon as I reached out to them and said, hey, this is what's going on, and now there's much more concerted effort that we will be included in this grant. Again, what I'm working on is executing that grant, but I just wanted to bring this forward to you because, essentially these are things that are scary for the public to hear about, like, wait, what is this? We're gonna have a regional approach, we're gonna get everybody off of septic systems. So I wanna frame all of this, this is a feasibility study, and much of it is overlapping with things that we already have to look at in our technical order. So whether or not, I personally champion this regional approach, or the idea that we would get everybody off of septic systems in Bolinas, it's something that we need to look at. Hey, what septic systems could we get off of, off of septic onto our sewer system? How can we expand our sewer system to accommodate more septic folks? Like, those are things that we need to directly address in our technical order. And so I would say that this is really, although it kind of came about in a weird way, it's really pretty good news in that we have some funding to do, very likely have some funding to do things that we otherwise had to do. Exactly what it ultimately looks like will obviously be fleshed out in the executed grant agreement. We are looking for some, essentially ensuring that the deliverables that are related to Bolinas, we have some oversight and control over, and that those, deliverables have express and explicit budgetary items associated with them to ensure that, this was funded because its regional approaches are championed, and we just need to make sure that, if this is, as it is, gonna be a regional approach that, and it implicates Bolinas, that we're essentially, involved. Yes, Andrew.
Does that mean that we would get some of the 1.2 million, or is it a separate grant that we would potentially be receiving?
No, I think the idea is it would be some of, and potentially a big chunk of the 1.2 million.
Cool.
What we would be looking to, what we're talking about is essentially, I'm actively communicating with folks at the Ocean Protection Council, and they've essentially said, hey, we could go through a whole other funding thing, and I think that could potentially jeopardize the funding. So I don't think that's necessarily the best path forward, but essentially we can do like a 10% increase off of the 1.2 and up the level of the grant. But again, I think some of it is, we have to hash it out with Stinson and ensure that, as an example, one of the parts of the feasibility study that needs to be looked at is like, well, what is the current capacity of our system?
Yeah.
And so that's a deliverable that, it makes sense for us to be involved in that, right? That's our system. So, and to what extent are we really doing a thorough job in that versus a more cursory thing? Is there a really extensive tech memo that comes out of, that is a deliverable that looks at our flows and loads in, winter versus dry year, whatever. So, anyway, again, it's not intended for you guys to ask me questions about the specifics here. I just wanted to there's a couple of items on the meeting tonight where it's like, hey, this is something that's happening. It will come back in December, probably even January. For, as an example, I think that I would request that the, as this gets, the grant gets executed, that essentially you guys write a letter of support and that gets retrospectively included in this because, you know, to me, it's a little bit of a glaring omission that that letter of support is not in here to begin with. So, anyway.
Okay.
But again, really appreciate working with Mark and Kent, on this and their, you know, willingness to kind of work with us, so. That is that, again, it's on for
Okay.
action. Any questions?
Going to item
Okay.
5.
Was the grant proposal approved? Do they have the?
It was approved for 1.2.
Right.
It is, again, I said, like I said, the grant, the executed grant agreement has not been fleshed out yet. That's what we're currently working on.
Okay.
Yeah. So, item 5 for discussion, sorry that this got complicated, but basically I just wanted to make sure that, Lena's had an opportunity to do what a lot of the other villages are doing, which is essentially this woman, I think her name is Kirsten Drum.
Kristen Drum,
Kristen. Sorry. Kristen Drum is a county rep who is coming and talking to folks about the proposed amendments to the local coastal plan. Essentially, I wanted to make sure that Bolinas had its own little, you know, presentation and people in the community had opportunity to provide feedback. So that, you know, through some back and forth with the Bolinas Civic Group, because they actually already had an intention that she would come and present, but through just some logistical issues, she wasn't gonna be able to present to them until January, and I think it's important for us to provide feedback on this process earlier rather than later. So essentially, we're looking for her to present on December 3rd at 5 p.m. and it will be hosted by the civic group. There's an error here. Basically, if more than 2 board members are interested in attending, I would suggest that we notice the meeting. So you guys don't need to necessarily decide that right now, but it might be helpful since everyone's here.
Usually just do a Brown Act notice and post an agenda.
Okay,
And then
and that
it's
will-
covered.
okay, but do you guys need to be there then, or no?
No, but if 3 of us happen to show up, then you're
It's noticed.
good.
Okay,
What if we show up on Zoom? Does that qualify?
It could. I just think you can't go wrong just by posting it.
Okay.
Yeah.
okay, we'll do that. But then the other thing, that was very helpful, I actually wasn't able to attend this Alliance of Coastal Marin Villages, but there's been a lot of back and forth and they've done a lot of legwork, a few of the members on that to really comb through the, local coastal plan and specifically the amendments. And essentially they prepared this like helpful cheat sheet that kind of points you to the things that they think are still potentially problematic and, you know, impacting, you know, us or people that live.
Okay.
That's great, because put on them for doing that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't necessarily, I mean, it's up on our board and people can read that if you guys have specific questions. But I also kind of wanted to use this as effectively a primer, so if you guys are interested in going to that December 3rd meeting, then you can kind of see what, you know, what may be of concern and where you might want to direct your attention after that. Okay,
Thank you. All right, then we'll go on to potential committee updates. Item 6.
we'll just do the bolded ones, I think,
Right.
is,
We've done 7.
yep,
Okay, and
And we-
6 and 8 are
we
not.
did
full.
9 too.
Yes, right. And there's nothing on 10 and 11. 12, is there anything on the Canyon?
I
Road
just
Committee?
wanted to say that, we will be meeting tomorrow, our committee on that.
Okay.
A reminder, Andrew and
Yeah.
Kevin don't look shocked.
Nope, yep, I'll be there.
Right, none of the standing committee updates are in bold, so I assume there's nothing on
Nope,
any of those. Okay, special reports and updates, number 19, then 20, resolution 733 for providing water data to the directors of the board. I think we do have,
yeah, we have that, it's, again, this numbering got a little wonky, sorry, it's item number 19. Again, what I was suggesting is that this is, just to remind everybody, this is, I don't know if it was maybe July, Kevin.
I think it was
requested-
August, yeah.
August, okay. Basically requested that we discuss the potential to share data, water use data with directors.
Mhm.
And then you guys had a pretty, long and deliberative conversation about what that might look like. And so this is, Belle and I worked on this to kind of distill that conversation. I'd say that it's pretty complicated, so what I was suggesting is that basically I would bring this forward before you. It's on for action if you guys want to make any decisions, but I'd say a more efficient use of your time is essentially look this over. I'll bring it back in December. If you have specific amendments you would like to make of it, then we could, talk about those and implement those then. And then I would bring it back, before, after you guys really kind of flesh it out, then I can, pass it by council and just make sure there's no, red flags there or nothing that needs to be amended, and then I would bring it back for approval in January. Kevin pointed out to me that he's not gonna be here at the January meeting, so it could be something where, again, I would say it's impractical for us to get into this right now here. So I would suggest that we essentially go through that process, for December meeting, which you will be at, and then we can delay the vote until he is able to participate.
Okay,
That's my recommendation. Are you, I don't know, obviously.
well, if you wanted to run it by council, you might as well do that sooner rather than later. I think this is a pretty good framework. And for what you're trying to get concerns.
Okay.
That was my question, has it been run by council yet?
No, I guess in my mind, I was thinking that if you guys had major revisions, that essentially I wouldn't have to run it by council twice.
Oh,
Cause so I could just basically look at whatever you guys wanna implement,
yeah,
modify it, and then pass it to them, and they could say, no, this is not gonna, maybe, maybe it's inevitable that you have to pass it by them twice, but.
I don't know.
Anyway.
What do you guys want to do? You're the one who,
Yeah, I'm the one who started this.
Yeah. you started.
I could talk for a minute and just catch Kirsten up if you want, because you weren't at this meeting or not.
Well, I can provide some context to this, so just to lay out sort of the idea of what was going on.
And then just my other question is, Grace had some concerns, so I just was wondering if those were addressed in the resolution, Grace, or do you still have some, I don't know, misgivings, or if you're comfortable with it? So sorry to interrupt, but if you want to give your intro, or if Grace wants to.
Yeah, I wanna go through it.
All right. I will just put it on
Okay,
there.
so I'm just gonna provide some context to like what you guys talked about at that meeting and why that ends up, getting regurgitated as this. The first part is basically, if you guys remember, when Kevin asked me this as a very kind of low bar, I said, passed it by council, is this idea even allowable? And essentially they said, yes, it's allowable. So the first portion of this, the whereases, are really, hey, these are things that we already do. We already have LWOPs, we already share data publicly. However, we also recognize that this is sensitive data, and we do our best to, ensure that we're not just like, spreading all of this information with the world. So that's the first portion. The second portion, and you'll see this in just the title of the resolution too, is that we got to this point where we said, okay, how about we have a single resolution, but it really deals with two different things. One is it spells out that staff, upon the direction of a director, can share water use data with that director. Okay, so you essentially don't necessarily even need to tell me what you want to do with that data. You just can, essentially come into the office and say, hey, I'd like to look at water use data from August, blah, 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 till then. And essentially, one of the things that Bella and I talked about is like, okay, what are the guardrails? We could have that be more stringent or less stringent in terms of, okay, you can only look at this data in the office. You can look at this data, And we'll send it to you, but you need to, it's gonna be a paper version, you need to bring it back to us and we'll burn it afterwards or whatever, right? So I think that's something that you guys will wanna kind of get into, or like, what are the guardrails to ensure that this data, which is normally just like sits in our, office or in our, cloud, is actually not gonna just get out with sharing of it. So that's the one thing, which is basically, very liberal in terms of, hey, this resolution allows us to share data with the director upon their request, but we need guardrails to ensure, like, what does that actually look like on a practical level? And then the other side of it is where we add a lot of stringency is around the dissemination. So that's where essentially, let's say Kevin comes to me, he says, I want this data, he does his whole thing, and then he's like, oh, wow, I found something really interesting that I want to share with the board. Effectively, what he would do is go to the board and say, hey, over the last, few months, I've been crunching this data, and I have data around, I don't know, like, water use during the summer months, let's say. Then you would get to ask him more questions about that data. What are the types of things that you want to share with us? I think, again, you could have guardrails around this needs to be redacted data. It needs to be aggregated so that, essentially, whatever guardrails you want to put on that end of things. But it essentially allows you a lot more scrutiny of, okay, and a board vote to essentially say, we're ready to see your data. Kevin, you can come before the next board meeting and effectively present that. So it adds some delay to this, but also more full board approval of dissemination of that data. So that's basically the framework of the whole resolution. Again, I would suggest that essentially you guys can like stew on it, think about the implications of whatever it is. And I'd recommend that you come back and for December with concrete amendments. But then again, when that then gets fleshed out, I can bring it by council. And so that by the time it gets approved by council, it's like, okay, we're ready to go.
Okay, all right. Let's do it.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Georgia.
Yeah. All right. There's nothing under item 24.
No, and we already did 23.
Yeah, and then the Jorge item 21, or that's 22 here.
Oh, sorry, yeah. That got moved to December.
Right, so that takes us to 24. We've done 23, 25 is the minutes of the August 21st regular board meeting.
Budget.
Hi,
Jenny.
Which was a closed session. Well, actually, yeah, it's a board
I
meeting.
combined them. Last time you guys were saying you had the closed session before and I hadn't captured that in the minutes for August. And so I just figured maybe the easiest way was to kind of combine the closed session in the front part of the minutes and then do the open session, the regular agenda, but I can always separate them out if you prefer.
It's fine. Does anybody have any changes or corrections to the minutes from August 21st?
No.
And if not, going to get a motion to approve the minutes.
I move to approve the August minutes.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Right. And then item 26. Minutes of the September 16th regular board meeting.
I have a very small change, Georgia, on
Okay.
page 1. Community expression. I joined the Zero Waste Marin local task force representative. But if you could add in the local task force, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, Belle, are you listening?
Yep.
No.
Yeah, yep.
Oh, Bell, sorry.
Yeah.
And these minutes were primarily done by Annie, so they're a little even more shortened than normal, but just wanted to let you know.
Okay. Any other changes or corrections to the September 16th minutes? Can I get a motion to approve them then?
I so move.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I would like to say that I would like more expanded minutes.
I'm sorry, you say that again, Grace?
I'd like the minutes to be a little more fleshed out than these are.
with some more summaries in the items.
This is. the
Too
fact
short.
that- I would
Okay,
agree, 'cause that's, yeah, when I read them earlier, I thought, oh.
To
okay.
brief.
Well, I don't know, I actually appreciate the brevity, I also appreciate the YouTube link to the minutes, and if.
Yeah,
you want some more detail, all the detail you could want is right there in the YouTube with the timestamp for, you know, many of these items, so. I think in the interest of saving staff time and having a link to the actual video, I think it's a pretty effective way to present the minutes. Rather than, you know, it's sort of a summary in writing, you know, these minutes often went 7 pages long, which is a lot of work for staff to create, so I actually like the shorter version, so.
All right, well, why don't we bear in mind Kevin's comments while at the same time appreciating that both Grace and Kirsten are looking for a little more substance.
Yeah.
yep. Okay.
You guys provide a balanced perspective.
There we go. Which takes
We'll
us.
do both.
Item 27, October 16th, regular board meeting minutes.
Oh, not done yet.
They're not here, okay, that takes us to item 20, which is the warrants. For the period September 12th through November 15th. Is there anybody have any questions about the warrants?
Just.
And if there aren't, I'm gonna get a motion to approve them.
Seemed cumulatively high.
What's that?
But when you, at the bottom, I mean, it was a total of 104, I don't. Kind of stood out to me as
Which one?
some big numbers.
Just the total of the warrants. I think.
Oh, that's a big number.
I mean, because there were some big ones in there, like West Yost Associates and. And the other one was Mission Square.
Yeah,
The health benefits.
Yeah, so one thing that you'll, I mean, unfortunately and fortunately, we have 2 new employees that are wonderful, but. We basically had a pretty slim, skeleton crew there for a while that I think was making our, books look a little better.
Good for the bottom line.
Yeah.
Not good for operations.
No.
but-
No.
All right, can I get a motion to approve the warrants?
I so moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, 5-0. Okay, then we're coming to the closing of the meeting. Materials to be signed, we'll do it if we have to. Future agenda items we've discussed, are there any others other than what we've talked about?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything to sign. Kevin already signed checks and there are no resolutions that are ready for signing from tonight's meeting. Is that correct, Belle? Think of anything that needs to be signed?
no, no.
Okay, and our next meeting is December the
11th at 5.
at
So,
5.
yes, that's what you
Is
did.
that what we did that to,
I don't know how you guys did that, but I appreciate it.
dinner to not. I think it was, maybe there's a civic group meeting that night. Is that-
Yeah, it was to accommodate the civic group meeting at 6, I think, and we were gonna ask them to push it back a little later, which I haven't heard back from them. I did reach out, but just so like Jenny could come to our meeting and their meeting essentially.
I mean, we're gonna have a 1-hour meeting.
Yeah, just can you imagine we can. Pull it off.
I like that goal.
All right, then.
One public comment can I make?
Please.
Just about our 2 new employees, Annie and Sean. I feel like the office is very vibrant and the crew is very happy. Despite our like failing infrastructure. So sometimes I can make it sound like everything's terrible. But like, I'd say the personal morale is very high and I don't know, felt.
Yeah, agreed.
That's good to hear. I was wondering about today, they were out in the rain, the operators were out, you know.
I know. Sean is getting to learn a lot about how things break around the district. But they've been great. Annie's been great. It's really good.
So with that, this meeting is adjourned.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm gonna stop recording.
Okay.